Every year, hikers convince themselves that one more mile, one more summit, or one more shortcut is worth the risk. Join me as I uncover the most reckless hiking deaths ever recorded, where a single bad decision turned breathtaking adventures into final journeys. From a couple who fired the only guide trying to save their lives, to experienced climbers who let one heated argument become their last mistake on Half Dome. These are the moments when the mountain always had the final word.
21st of June, 2017, a little after 10 in the morning. And deep in the Grand Canyon, the air was already building toward the kind of afternoon that kills, with the heat down at the river climbing past 110 degrees, when a middle-aged couple stopped at a shaded oasis called Indian Garden and began arguing with the one man they had hired to keep them alive, about to send him back up the trail without them. They were a married couple in their early 50s, Del Bramble and his wife Corinne, and they were, by every ordinary measure, exactly the kind of people you would expect to be fine. They were fit for their age, careful, and almost obsessively prepared. They came from a cool green part of the country where the summers are mild and the hills are gentle and shaded, and they had spent years hiking the trails near home every weekend, building up what they believed was real experience and real toughness. They were planners, the kind of couple who turned every trip into a project, who made spreadsheets and packing lists and studied the reviews of everything they bought. They read everything, watched every video, bought the right boots and the right packs and the right little bottles of electrolyte tablets. And they took a quiet pride in never being the unprepared tourist they saw getting into trouble on the news. In their whole lives together, being careful and being determined had never once failed them. It was who they were, and it was the reason they had a good life, and it had taught them a lesson that would prove fatal in the one place it did not apply, which was that if you just prepared hard enough and refused to quit, you could do anything you set your mind to. The Grand Canyon had been on their list for a long time, the trip they promised themselves, and the one thing they wanted more than anything was to stand at the very bottom, at the edge of the Colorado River, and say they had done it. They had trained for a year, they had earned this, they felt, and they were not the type to do it halfway. For months before the trip, they had let everyone around them know it was coming. There was a countdown on their social pages, and there were photographs of the training hikes. The two of them grinning on their local hills, with captions about how the Grand Canyon was next, about how they were finally doing the big one. They told friends and family the same thing over and over, that they were going all the way to the river, all the way to the bottom, that they had not spent a year training just to stop halfway down and turn around like the day tourists who only came for a photo at the top. Reaching the Colorado River had quietly become the whole point of the thing, the promise they had made out loud to everyone they knew, the story they were already half telling before they had lived it. They studied maps of the trail until they could recite the mileage and the landmarks by heart, and they came to believe, the way careful and capable people sometimes do, that knowing about a thing was the same as being ready for it, that having read about the heat was the same as having survived it. They pictured the triumph at the bottom 100 times. What none of their reading and none of their planning ever quite made real to them was the single plain fact that mattered more than all the rest of it combined, which was that everything they walked down, every easy step, they would have to climb back up in the worst heat of the day, on legs and hearts and minds that would have nothing left to give. I want to say up front that these two were not reckless. They planned every detail and trained for a year. And that's what makes it so hard, because preparation gave them a confidence the canyon doesn't honor. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand that the Grand Canyon works backwards from every hike these two had ever done. On almost any other trail, you climb up first, when your legs are fresh and the morning is cool, and then you come down when you are tired, which is the easy direction, so the reward and the rest come at the end. The canyon flips all of that on its head. You start at the top, on the rim, in the cool, clean air, and you walk down, feeling wonderful, feeling strong, losing thousands of feet of elevation without hardly trying, grinning the whole way, and every one of those easy downhill steps is a step you are borrowing, a step you will have to repay later by climbing back up the same enormous wall of rock on legs that will no longer be fresh. The trouble is that the bottom of the canyon is not cool. It is a deep, narrow gorge of dark, ancient stone that soaks up the sun all day and holds it like the inside of an oven, routinely 20 to 30 degrees hotter than the rim far above, so that a pleasant morning of 80 degrees up top becomes 110 or 115 degrees down at the river, with the trail surface underfoot hotter still. The rangers there have a saying they repeat to anyone who will listen, that going down is optional, but coming up is mandatory, and it is the truest thing anyone can tell you about that place. It means the descent is a choice you make freely, feeling great, and the ascent is a debt that will be collected no matter what, whether you have the strength left to pay it or not. A good guide exists to protect you from the one mistake the canyon is designed to trick you into, which is going too far down, too late in the morning, chasing a reward at the bottom that you will simply not have the body or the cool hours to climb back from. Here's the thing almost nobody understands before they go. It's the only hike I know where the easy part comes first and the part that kills you comes last, when your tank is already empty. The thing that kills people down there is heat, and heat kills in a way that is far more insidious than most people realize. Your body is a machine that runs at one steady temperature, and it works hard all the time to hold that temperature no matter what the world around it is doing. In extreme heat, when you are exerting yourself, climbing, sweating, that machine can start to take on warmth faster than it can shed it. Sweat stops being enough, especially in a place where there is no shade and no cool air to be found anywhere. The core temperature begins to climb, and once it pushes past a certain threshold, the body's whole cooling system begins to fail all at once, and you slide from heat exhaustion into heat stroke, which is a true medical emergency that can kill a healthy adult in a shockingly short time. And here's the cruel part, the part that makes it so deadly on a trail with no easy way out. As the brain itself overheats, the first things to go are judgment and coordination. People in the grip of heat stroke grow confused. They stop making sense. They sometimes feel a strange calm or even a burst of misplaced euphoria. They make terrible decisions. They wander off the trail. They stop drinking. They sit down in the sun. They insist to anyone nearby that they are fine and just need a minute. Water helps, but water alone cannot stop heat stroke once it takes hold. And drinking too much water while sweating out all your salt brings on its own separate and dangerous crisis. By the time a person is in real danger down there, the part of their mind that should be screaming at them to stop, to cool down, to get help, is very often the exact part that has already quietly stopped working. This is why the rangers are so insistent that you plan your day around the clock and the thermometer instead of around how you feel, because how you feel is the one instrument you cannot trust once the heat has you. A strong, fit, determined person feeling good at the bottom of that canyon at noon is not a safe person. They are very often a person whose body has already started to fail and whose brain has not yet been told. Think with me about how cruel that is. The heat cooks the exact part of your brain that would tell you to stop, so by the time you're in real danger, the judge in your head has already left. Emmett was the guide they had hired, a man who had grown up in that country and had walked the trails of the canyon more times than he could possibly count, who had pulled more overconfident hikers back from the edge of real disaster than he cared to remember. He was not a reckless man, and his plan for the Brambles was a careful one, built on everything the canyon had taught him. They would start down in the cool dark before dawn, headlamps on, when the air was still kind and the rock had given up its heat overnight, and they would descend only as far as a green-shaded oasis partway down the trail called Indian Garden, and then they would turn and be climbing steadily back toward the rim well before the heat of the day came down on the inner canyon like a hammer. The river was not on his plan, and he had told them that plainly more than once, and he had told them exactly why, because reaching the river in the last week of June and then trying to climb nearly 4,500 feet back out of the gorge in the afternoon is the precise thing that fills the canyon's long list of the dead. For the first few hours, everything went beautifully, exactly the way it always does right before it goes wrong. They went down through the cool gray morning, feeling strong and happy, and more than a little vindicated. The enormous walls opening up around them in the growing light, the miles falling away under their boots. And that feeling, that easy, effortless downhill strength in the cool of the morning, was the very trap the canyon lays for everyone who comes. Because the better they felt going down, the more certain they became that Emmett was being an old woman about the whole thing, that his cautious little turnaround was meant for weaker and softer people than the two of them, and that the river, their river, the entire reason they had come, was sitting right there for the taking. Somewhere on the way down, in the last stretch where a signal still reached the bottom of the canyon, Corinne sent a text to a friend back home, one her friend would later share, and it survives now in the way these last messages always seem to, made unbearable by everything that came after it. She wrote that they were deep in the canyon and feeling amazing, that the views were beyond anything the photographs had ever promised, that they were close now, so close to the river they had crossed the entire country to touch. She made a small joke about the guide wanting to turn them around early, something light and dismissive about how he clearly did not know who he was dealing with, how the two of them had not trained for a solid year just to quit a couple of miles short of the whole point. She said the morning had been the easiest hiking of her life, which to anyone who knows that canyon is the most frightening line in the whole message, because the ease of the way down is precisely the lie the place tells you. She said she would send a picture from the bottom, from the water's edge, the very moment they reached it. She told her friend she loved her and that this was the best day of her life. It was the last thing anyone back home ever heard from her. Someone named Nova Storm summed it up perfectly on my last video, that if life has never smacked you in the face, one day it certainly will. That was Del and Corinne two people who were sure they'd never lose a battle. It came to a head at Indian Garden, late in the morning, with the heat already building fast and the two of them still riding high on that downhill confidence. This was the turnaround, Emmett told them. This was the spot, this was the time, and every single minute they spent going lower was a minute they would pay for twice over on the way back up, in heat that was about to turn deadly. The river was still about a few miles further down, and well over 1,000 feet of steep descent below them, and the plain arithmetic of it was simple and merciless, that if they went to the water now, they would be climbing back out in the killing heat of the afternoon with nothing left in the tank. He was not asking, and he was not negotiating. It was the most important call a canyon guide ever makes, the entire reason a sane person hires one in the first place, and he made it as clearly and as firmly as he knew how, looking them in the eye and telling them the truth, and they refused him. To two people who had trained for a year and promised the whole world they would reach the river, a guide telling them to stop a couple of miles short did not land as wisdom, and it did not land as safety. It landed as insult. It sounded like a lack of faith in them, like timidity, like a cautious man covering himself while their dreams sat right there in plain view, close enough to taste. They had spent their whole lives being told that quitting was the only real failure, that the people who succeeded were the ones who pushed through when others turned back. So they told Emmett that they would go on to the river without him, that they had not come all this way and trained all that time to be turned around a stone's throw from the finish. And in so many words, standing there in the rising heat, they let him go. What gets me most is the timing of it. They fired the one man reading the clock and the thermometer for them at the exact moment those two things were about to matter more than anything else on Earth. People always ask why he did not simply stop them, or refuse, or physically drag them back up the trail to safety, and the answer is one of the hardest parts of this whole story. A guide cannot force two grown adults to turn around, and the moment they dismissed him, in plain words, in front of other hikers, he had no authority over them at all. The trail itself is public, and day hiking it requires no permit of any kind, so there was no ranger at a gate, no rule, nothing on Earth that could legally stop two determined adults from walking as far down as they wanted to go. He could not follow them down to the river either, not safely, because doing so would have put him in the exact same deadly trap he was trying to pull them out of, descending lower and later into the building heat with a climb out that only got worse and more lethal by the hour. He argued with them hard, far harder than his job or his contract required him to. He told them plainly, without softening any of it, that people died doing exactly this, that the heat at the bottom would not care in the slightest how fit or how prepared or how determined they were, that the climb back out would break bodies far stronger than theirs. He gave them what extra water he could safely spare, and he told them the truth to their faces one last time, that if they went down now, in this, they might very well not come back up. They thanked him, more or less, and went anyway. And then, because there was truly nothing else that he was allowed or able to do, he went straight to the small ranger station there at Indian Garden, where a summer ranger and an emergency phone sit, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. And he raised the alarm the instant the two of them were out of sight, heading down toward the river into the worst heat of the day. Imagine being Emmett on that climb out. I can't think of anything worse, seeing the whole thing coming, having said it to their faces, and being ordered away with nothing left that you're allowed to do. They did reach the river. That is the part that makes this so hard to tell. Sometime in the heavy, pressing heat of the early afternoon, the two of them came down the last steep switchbacks of a brutal section that the old-timers call the Devil's Corkscrew, and out onto the sand at the edge of the Colorado, and they got the exact thing they had crossed the entire country for: the cold green water, the photograph, the promise kept in full. You can imagine the triumph of that moment, the pure vindication of it, the two of them standing at the bottom of the world, having done it their own way, having looked a lifelong expert in the eye and pushed past him and been proven right, or so it must have felt. But the river was never the achievement, and it was never even really the halfway point, because the true halfway point on that trail is not measured in miles walked, it is measured in what your body has left to give, and by the time they turned around to start back up, they had already quietly spent almost all of it. They were now nearly 4,500 feet below the rim, in temperatures well past 110 degrees, with the sun directly overhead and the dark rock radiating heat from every side, facing a climb that would have been serious for a fresh hiker in the cool of dawn. Every easy downhill step from that beautiful, cool morning had just come due, all at once with brutal interest, and there was no guide beside them now, no shade to hide in, and not one single cool hour left anywhere in the day to spend. Now, I've stood at the bottom of some brutal climbs myself, but every step those two took down into that canyon was one that they would have to repay later, uphill, in the hottest part of the day. There is a last image of them that stays with the people who pieced this together afterward, drawn from the photographs later recovered from the phone found with them, and from the accounts of the hikers who passed them going the other way. There they are at the river's edge, at the very bottom of the whole world, sunburned and beaming and utterly, completely happy, holding up the moment they had promised everyone, the cold green water at their backs, the great walls rising up and up and up on every side of them. In that photograph, they do not look like people in danger. They look like people at the top of a dream. People who had been told no and had done it anyway and been proven right. People in the single best moment of a life spent chasing exactly this kind of moment. That is the thing that makes it so hard to look at now. What the photograph does not show, what neither of them could feel yet through the joy and the adrenaline and the deep, pleasant exhaustion, was that the air around them was already lethal, that their bodies had already begun the slow, quiet failure that killing heat brings on, and that the wall of rock behind them, the one they now had to turn and climb thousands of feet of it in the full afternoon sun, had already quietly decided how the rest of their day was going to go. It is the last clear picture of them alive, two people smiling at the bottom of a beautiful trap they had fought so hard to spring on themselves. Del and Corinne Bramble never made it back up to the rim. On the long, brutal climb out of the inner gorge, in the very worst of the afternoon heat, their bodies did exactly what Emmett had promised them they would do, and exactly what the canyon does to so many people every single summer. Somewhere on the steep exposed switchbacks above the river, with the dark rock throwing the heat back at them from every side and not a scrap of shade to be found, the heat overtook them, first one of them and then the other. Their core temperatures climbed past the point of no return, and their minds slid into the confusion and the terrible false calm that heat stroke brings, the same cruel process that has taken so many before them. They would have grown confused. They would have stopped making sense to each other. They would have stopped being able to climb, and then stopped being able to stand, and somewhere in there, the part of them that understood they were dying would have quietly switched off. Emmett had reached a ranger and raised the alarm as fast as any human being could have, and a rescue was launched the moment the words were out of his mouth. But the inner canyon in that kind of heat is one of the hardest places on the entire continent to reach a dying person in time, and help that has to descend into a furnace in order to climb back out of it moves slowly and at terrible risk to the rescuers themselves. By the time anyone could reach them, high on the wall above the river they had fought so hard to touch, there was nothing left to be done for either of them. They had gotten their river. It had cost them everything they had, and then their lives. The recovery, like everything else in that canyon, was slow and dangerous and heartbreaking, carried out in heat that threatened the very rangers sent down to bring them home. And Emmett, the guide who had grown up in that country and had done every single thing right, carried something up out of that canyon that no person should ever have to carry. He had read the day exactly correctly, down to the hour. He had said the words out loud, plainly, to their faces, more than once. He had been fired for it, and had raised the alarm at the ranger station the instant they were out of sight, and it had still not been enough to save them, because the decision that killed them had already been made and sealed the moment they walked past him at Indian Garden toward the river. Everyone who understood that canyon knew, with total and complete certainty, that it was not his fault, that he had done more than his job asked of him, and more than most guides would have dared. But knowing a thing like that and living with it are two entirely different weights, and Emmett would carry the memory of that morning, and of the look on their faces when they told him to go, for a very long time, maybe for the rest of his life. He had spent his whole life learning to read that place, and the one time it mattered most, the people he was reading it for would not listen. This is the line the rangers there repeat like a prayer. Down is optional, but up is mandatory. Del and Corinne proved it in the cruelest way I know of. In the end, the thing that killed Del and Corinne was not the heat exactly, and it was not bad luck, and it was not a lack of preparation, because heaven knows they had prepared for a solid year. It was the reward itself. It was the river. The very goal they had crossed the country for. The dream they had promised everyone they loved. The thing they fired their own guide in order to reach was the exact trap the whole trip had been built around. And the turnaround they refused at Indian Garden was the single thing that would have saved both of their lives. Down is optional, the rangers say, and up is mandatory, and the Brambles proved that grim little sentence as completely as anyone ever has. They had spent a year learning everything there was to learn about that canyon, except the one lesson that actually mattered in the end, which is that the canyon does not care how ready you feel, or how far you have already come, or how much the dream is worth to you, or what you promised the people back home. It does not grade on effort or on desire. It asks one question and one question only, which is whether you turned around in time. And a few miles from the bottom, on the best morning of their entire lives, feeling stronger than they ever had, they looked at the one man whose whole job was to answer that question for them. And they decided that they knew better.
The part I can't stop thinking about is that they actually succeeded. They reached the river they dreamed about, they got their photograph, and that victory was the exact thing that killed them both on the way back up.
I do not tell this story to mock them, because there is nothing funny in it, and because what drove them was something most of us would recognize in ourselves. They were not fools, and they were not arrogant in the way we usually mean it. They were careful people who wanted, badly, to finish the thing they had started, who had promised themselves and everyone they loved that they would reach the bottom, and who could not bear to turn around a few miles short of a dream they had carried for years. That impulse to push through, to not quit, to finish what you set out to do, is the very thing we praise in people almost everywhere else in life. But a place like the bottom of the Grand Canyon in June does not reward that impulse. It punishes it without mercy and without exception. The hardest and most important skill in the wild is not endurance or courage or preparation. It is the humility to turn around, on time, short of the goal, when the person who knows more than you tells you it is time to go home. It is the willingness to let the canyon win the argument. Del and Corinne could not do it. Almost no one who dies that way ever could. And their guide was already high on the trail above them, climbing out into the safe, cool evening, listening for a helicopter that would arrive far too late to matter. It was July 19th, 2019, when 25-year-old Elena Ivanov and 27-year-old Mark John Lomeli laced up their boots in the pitch-black parking lot of Yosemite Valley hours before sunrise, ready to take on Half Dome.
And listen, if you know anything about this trail, you know that starting in the dark isn't dramatic flair, it's basically mandatory.
This hike eats up 14 to 16 miles round trip depending on which trailhead you start from, with something like 4,800 feet of elevation gain packed into that distance, which, if you're not a hiker, is roughly the equivalent of climbing 3.5 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. And the final stretch, the part everyone actually comes for, involves climbing a nearly vertical granite slope using nothing but 2 steel cables bolted into the rock with wooden boards laid across every 8 feet or so to give your shaking legs something to stand on. People who try to start late get caught on that dome in the middle of the afternoon, sweating, dehydrated, and terrified because a summer thunderstorm can roll in out of nowhere and turn that smooth granite into the deadliest slip and slide on the planet. So yeah, an early start makes sense.
What doesn't make sense, and what makes my stomach turn every time I read through the reports on this one, is everything else that happened that day.
Here's the thing about Elena and Mark that their friends all agreed on afterward. Once it was too late for the agreement to matter, they looked perfect on paper. Both experienced climbers. Both had been together for years. Both had summited things that would make most of us throw up just looking at the elevation profile. But the people who climbed with them described a difference in style that had only grown sharper over time. Elena treated every climb like it was the first one, sticking to checklists and refusing to rush routine safety steps. Mark had the kind of confidence that often comes from years of getting away with cutting small corners, trusting experience to cover for habits that had slowly become shortcuts. But according to people close to them, there had been a slow crack forming in that relationship for months, and it wasn't about climbing gear or safety habits, not directly anyway. It was about control. Mark liked to move fast and trust his gut. Elena liked to move carefully and trust her checklist. On a hiking trail, that kind of mismatch just means one person gets annoyed waiting for the other to double knot their shoelaces. On a granite rock face 2,000 feet above a valley floor, that kind of mismatch can kill you.
And I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think we all know a couple like this. Maybe you've even been half of a couple like this.
The push and pull between someone who wants to just go and someone who wants to make sure going doesn't get you killed. Usually the stakes are dinner reservations or who's driving. Here, the stakes turned out to be a 2,000-foot drop.
I keep coming back to the fact that they argued the entire way up the switchbacks before dawn. Not a little tension, not a passing snippy comment.
According to a solo hiker named Leo, who ended up about 10 minutes behind them for most of the morning, their voices carried. He could hear them going back and forth even from a distance, the kind of hushed, clipped arguing that couples do when they're trying to keep their voice down but are too upset to actually manage it. Leo later told investigators that he almost called out to ask if everyone was okay, but talked himself out of it because, in his words, it just felt like normal couple stuff, the kind of bickering everybody's seen 100 times on a hiking trail.
And honestly, That's such a human thing to do, isn't it?
We hear tension between two people and we assume it's not our business. We assume it'll blow over. We assume the worst thing that happens is an awkward car ride home. Nobody assumes it's the opening act of a fatal accident. By the time the three of them reach the base of the subdome, that final rocky staircase before you even get to the cables, the whispering had stopped altogether. They weren't bothering to hide it anymore. Leo told investigators later that he heard Mark tell Elena to just trust him for once, and heard Elena snap back something about how trusting him nearly got them both killed on a previous climb. That's not a throwaway line. That's not just relationship drama. That's someone telling you out loud in front of a witness that this person has already put her life in danger before.
I don't know about you, but if my hiking partner said something like that to me on a normal Tuesday hike, I'd probably suggest we turn around and get pancakes instead.
I would not be strapping into a rope system with that person 45 minutes later. Now, this is going to sound harsh, but I think it needs saying. Mountains do not care about your relationship problems. They don't pause for you to work through your feelings. Half Dome, in particular, has a brutal, almost mathematical indifference to human drama. Roughly a dozen people have died on or near that formation over the decades, some from falls off the cables, some from falls off the sheer faces around it, and almost every single case comes down to the same handful of ingredients: fatigue, bad weather, overconfidence, or a moment of distraction at exactly the wrong second. It does not discriminate between a couple having the best day of their lives and a couple who are one bad decision away from a funeral. The mountain was the same rock either way. The only variable that day was the two humans climbing it, and from everything we know, those two humans were already running on fumes emotionally before they even touched the summit.
And look, I want to be fair to both of them here, because it's easy to sit behind a microphone months later and judge two exhausted people making split-second decisions on a very little amount of sleep.
Climbing partnerships, especially long-term ones like theirs, run on an enormous amount of built-up trust. When you've climbed with somebody for years, you develop shortcuts, unspoken routines, a rhythm where you don't have to spell out every single step because you already know how the other person operates. That trust is usually a good thing. It's what lets two people move efficiently and safely through terrain that would take a stranger twice as long to navigate. But that same trust can curdle into something dangerous the second it gets paired with resentment, because now you've got someone who still expects to be listened to instantly, still expects the shortcuts to work, but the goodwill underneath all of it has worn thin. I think that's basically what we were watching play out on that ridge before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon. So they made it. Exhausted, dehydrated probably, definitely worn thin from hours of bickering, but they made it to the top of Half Dome.
And this is the part of the story that I think hits people the hardest, because it's the part that feels the most familiar. At the summit, something shifted.
Not because the argument was resolved, not because either of them apologized. It shifted because it was time for the photo. You know this moment. Maybe not on a 2,000-foot granite dome, but you know this moment. The forced smile that clicks on like a light switch the second a camera comes out. Elena and Mark stood near the edge, with the entire Yosemite Valley sprawled out behind them in that famous golden late morning light, and they put their arms around each other, and they smiled, and they took what would become one of the most quietly devastating photographs I've ever had described to me. Leo was close enough to watch the whole thing happen, and what he noticed wasn't the view, it was the mechanics of the pose. He said Mark's hand gripped Elena's shoulder just a little too hard, the kind of grip that looks affectionate in a photo but probably left a mark if you looked closely enough. And he said Elena's smile didn't reach her eyes.
That's such a small, specific detail, but it's the kind of detail that sticks with you, isn't it?
A smile that's all mouth and no eyes is basically the human body's way of screaming that everything is not fine, while the mouth insists that everything is great. There's also something almost cruelly ironic about the timing here, and I don't think it's a coincidence exactly, more like a pattern you see over and over in situations like this. The photo happens right at the peak, both literally and emotionally. It's the highest point of the trip, the moment everything was building toward, and it becomes this brief little ceasefire where both people agree, silently, to pretend for 10 seconds. And then the second that pretending is no longer required, the second the phone goes back in the pocket, all the tension that got paused for the photo comes rushing right back in, except now it's compounded by exhaustion and the growing awareness that the hardest, most dangerous part of the day, the actual technical descent, still hadn't even started yet. I also can't help but notice how much effort went into staging something that lasted a grand total of maybe 10 seconds. Finding the right angle so the valley showed up properly behind them, adjusting the arm placement, making sure neither of them was squinting into the sun, all that effort for a piece of content that would exist for less time than it took to actually set up, And meanwhile, the two of them hadn't spent even a fraction of that same care or patience on the rope system that was about to decide whether they lived or died.
I don't think that's a coincidence either. A photo has an immediate visible payoff. People will see it, comment on it, tell you how jealous they are of your adventurous life.
A properly locked carabiner has no audience at all. Nobody claps for you when you take the extra 3 seconds to double check a gate. The tragedy is that the thing with zero social reward turned out to be the only thing that actually mattered. And then, just like that, the mask came off, the phone went back in the pocket, and by every account, the argument picked right back up as they started packing their gear for the descent. No transition, no cooldown period, no moment of connection carried over from the photo. It was like the photo had been a commercial break in the middle of a fight, and once the commercial ended, the show just kept going exactly where it left off.
That, to me, is almost scarier than the argument itself. It tells you that the tension between them wasn't a blip.
And the smiling photo was the fiction layered on top of it. If you've ever had a fight with someone, paused to be polite in front of other people, and then immediately picked the fight back up the second you were alone again, you already understand exactly the emotional temperature these two were operating at. Now we get to the part of this story that turns from sad relationship drama into an actual technical tragedy. And I want to slow way down here, because the mechanics matter. This is the part where a series of small, almost boringly ordinary decisions stacked on top of each other until there was no way to stop what came next. Getting down from the top of Half Dome the way most hikers do just means going back down the same 2 cables you climbed up, hand over hand, leaning back against gravity while your legs shake from exhaustion. But Elena and Mark weren't doing the tourist route down. They were experienced climbers, and they had planned to descend via the northwest face, which involves actual technical rope work, not just white-knuckling a steel cable. That means rappelling, which is the technique where you use a rope, an anchor point bolted into the rock, and a friction device to lower yourself down a cliff face in a controlled way. Done correctly, it's honestly a beautiful bit of engineering. It's basically controlled falling. You're trusting a rope about as thick as your finger, a couple of metal bolts drilled into stone, and a little friction hardware to lower your entire body weight down a sheer wall of granite. Done incorrectly, it is one of the fastest ways imaginable to fall to your death, because you are quite literally trusting your life to a couple of pieces of metal and a length of rope, and there's very little room for error anywhere in that chain. They reached the first rappel station, a 2-bolt anchor drilled into the granite at the top of the face, and Elena took the lead in setting it up. This wasn't unusual. By every account, Elena was the more meticulous of the two, the one who double-checked things, the one who read the manual instead of winging it. But she was also at this point running on almost no sleep, dehydrated from the long climb, and emotionally rattled from hours of arguing. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. As she began threading the rope through the anchor system, both of them clipped their personal tethers into the anchor while they prepared the rappel, exactly the way experienced climbers normally would. Mark apparently stood behind her and, according to other climbers, checking his watch, sighing loudly enough that she couldn't pretend not to notice. He told her she was taking forever. He told her it was just a 2-bolt anchor, not rocket science, and that she should just clip it already. I want to take a beat here and actually explain what a carabiner is doing in this situation, because I think once you understand the mechanics, this story becomes about 10 times more horrifying. A carabiner is that oval-shaped metal clip that climbers use to connect a rope to an anchor. Most of them have what's called a locking sleeve, basically a little collar around the gate of the carabiner that you twist to keep the gate from accidentally popping open. When it's locked properly, that carabiner is essentially a solid closed loop of metal, and nothing short of a saw is getting that rope out of it. But when the sleeve isn't fully twisted closed, the gate can still swing open under the right kind of pressure, and suddenly that solid loop of metal isn't solid at all. It's just a curved piece of metal with a rope resting against it, held in place by nothing but luck and gravity. Think of it like a seatbelt that clicks into place but isn't actually latched all the way. It looks fine sitting there. It feels fine when you tug on it gently. It's only in the moment of real impact that you find out it was never actually doing its job. Under the pressure of Mark's nagging, Elena rushed through the setup. She pushed the rope through the carabiner, but she didn't fully rotate that locking sleeve shut. It was left hanging open by roughly a quarter turn, which sounds like nothing, but in climbing terms is the difference between a failsafe system and a loaded trap. To make things even worse, the carabiner wasn't hanging freely the way it's supposed to. It had shifted so that it was pressed up against a sharp horn of rock jutting out beside the anchor. Climbers call this being cross-loaded, which basically means the carabiner is being pushed on from a sideways angle instead of pulling straight down along its strongest axis. A carabiner that's cross-loaded is dramatically weaker than one loaded normally, sometimes only able to hold a small fraction of its rated strength. And worse, that sideways pressure against a rock edge can actually help pry an unlocked gate open even further, almost like using the rock itself as a tiny crowbar. Elena seemed to sense something was off, because she reached back toward the carabiner and said she wanted to double-check the gate according to one of the climbers.
This is the moment that honestly breaks my heart a little every time I think about it, because she was right.
If she had gotten even 3 more seconds to finish that check, this entire story would have a different ending. As Elena started transitioning from her personal tether onto her rappel device, Mark, convinced everything was already fine, unclipped his own tether without waiting for their usual partner check. Frustrated and impatient, he brushed her hand aside. He said something about testing it himself to prove her paranoia wrong, and then leaned back to weight the rappel system before beginning his descent. Think about what that action actually did in physical terms. He took a carabiner that was already cross-loaded against a rock edge, with its gate already sitting open by a quarter turn, and he applied a sudden, forceful sideways and downward jerk to it. The rock horn acted like a lever against the gate. The unlocked gate, already under lateral pressure, sprang the rest of the way open, and the rope, which had never actually been securely clipped in the first place, simply slid straight out of the carabiner, as if it had never been attached to anything at all. 2 seconds earlier, that same rope looked completely normal, completely trustworthy, hanging there exactly the way a properly set anchor is supposed to look. That's the part that gets me. From a few feet away, there was no visible red flag, no fraying rope, no bent metal, no obvious warning sign. Just a quarter turn of a locking sleeve that never got finished. This wasn't some freak, unpredictable failure of modern engineering. Carabiners are unbelievably strong pieces of equipment when used correctly, rated to hold thousands of pounds of force along their strong axis. This was 100% a human failure, a chain of small human decisions, each one explainable on its own, that added up to a catastrophe. Elena rushing because she felt pressured. Mark dismissing a safety concern because he was impatient and wanted to prove a point. Nobody taking those extra 3 seconds to actually finish the check. In almost every version of that situation in your own life, the worst outcome is embarrassment or a redo. In this one, the worst outcome was the only outcome anyone got. Something else worth knowing here, because it explains why nobody caught this in time, is that a partially locked carabiner and a fully locked one look almost identical from even a couple feet away. You'd basically need to be staring directly at that little collar, maybe even running a finger over it, to notice the quarter turn that hadn't gone all the way. From where Mark was standing, hovering impatiently and checking his watch, there was nothing about that setup that screamed danger. That's actually one of the scariest things about climbing safety in general. The equipment rarely fails in some dramatic, obvious way, like a rope visibly fraying or a bolt visibly cracking. It usually fails in these tiny, invisible, procedural ways. A half turn that didn't get finished, a strap that got threaded backward, a knot that looks right but is actually one loop short of being right. Experienced climbers build entire habits and checklists specifically to catch these invisible failures, which is exactly the kind of habit Elena was in the middle of following when she got interrupted. What happened next took less than 2 seconds from start to finish, according to the climber who witnessed it from about 10 feet away, waiting his turn to use the same anchor. Mark, who had just yanked on a rope that was no longer actually attached to anything, didn't even have time to properly scream. He simply dropped. His body pitched backward into open air, arms flailing for something, anything, to grab onto, but there was nothing there. He had unclipped the safety himself, with his own hands, in an attempt to prove that it didn't need double checking.
But here's the detail that makes this so much worse than a single tragic accident, and it's the detail that I think about more than any other part of this story.
Elena had already unclipped her personal tether and was in the middle of transferring her weight onto her own rappel device when Mark prematurely weighted the system. It was one of those awkward transition moments every experienced climber goes through, where you're no longer fully protected by your tether, but haven't completely committed to the rappel yet. The second his body weight hit the end of that line, with the sudden, violent force of a falling human being, the improperly secured rope tore free from the anchor, and the violent, unexpected movement threw Elena off balance right at the lip of the cliff. She didn't get a chance to brace herself, didn't get a chance to grab onto the rock, didn't get any warning beyond the sound of the rope suddenly snapping free of the anchor. She stumbled forward into open air, and her gasp was cut short as she sailed straight over the edge behind him, following almost exactly the path his body had already taken. I don't think there's a way to talk about this part of the story without acknowledging how genuinely awful it is that Elena, the one person in this entire sequence of events who tried to slow things down and do it right, ended up paying the same price as the person who ignored her. There's no lesson in that makes it feel fair, because it isn't fair. She reached for the gate, She said she wanted to check it. She was overruled by someone who was in a hurry. And because the two of them were connected by that single rope, his mistake became her sentence too. If there's a single image from this entire tragedy that I can't shake, it's that one. Not the fall itself, but the fact that the rope that was supposed to save both their lives ended up being the exact mechanism that took Elena down alongside Mark, even though she never once let go of her own caution. It's worth pointing out too, just how quickly the whole thing unfolded once that gate opened. We're talking about a window of time shorter than it takes to read this sentence out loud. There was no slow motion moment where someone could have shouted a warning, no gap where a hand could have shot out to grab a rock or a strap. The physics of it were just too fast and too unforgiving. Once Mark's weight came off that rope in that specific direction, the outcome for both of them was already locked in. That's part of what makes rock climbing simultaneously so beautiful and so unforgiving as a sport. Almost everything about it can be done safely, with the right preparation and the right patience. But the margin for error, when it does show up, is essentially zero. Can you imagine? The witness was only 10 feet away and couldn't have done a single thing differently. And I don't say that to let him off the hook, because he never should have been out there in the first place. He wasn't close enough to physically intervene, and by the time the sound of the rope leaving the carabiner registered in his brain as something wrong instead of something routine, both Elena and Mark were already falling. That's the cruelest part of accidents like this for the people who witness them. Your brain needs a beat to process that the ordinary sound of gear clicking has actually just become the sound of somebody's life ending, and by the time that beat passes, the moment where you could have helped is already gone. He didn't fail them. The rope failed them, or more accurately, the sequence of choices that led to that rope being clipped wrong failed them, probably minutes before he ever set eyes on the anchor at all. The climber who witnessed it, the one who had been standing about 10 feet away waiting to use that same anchor, told investigators that he heard the rope slither and unclip, then the sharp whoosh of air as two bodies fell past him, and then nothing. Just silence on top of a granite dome that moments earlier had two arguing, exhausted, very much alive human beings standing on it. Rescue teams were eventually able to recover both Elena and Mark from the base of the northwest face, but there was nothing to be done for either of them by that point. What should have been remembered as a couple's difficult but ultimately successful summit of one of the most iconic hikes in the country instead became a case study in how quickly things can unravel when exhaustion, ego, and a few loose inches of unlocked metal all show up on the same rock face at the same time. I keep thinking about that photo. Somewhere on a phone that was recovered from the accident site, there's a picture of two people smiling at the camera with the Yosemite Valley behind them, taken maybe 20 minutes before they both died. It's the kind of photo that gets 100 likes and a handful of comments about relationship goals, and nobody scrolling past it would ever guess what was actually happening in the seconds before and after the shutter clicked.
The gap between what a photo shows you and what was actually happening in that moment is, I think, the real story here. More than the carabiner, more than the argument, more than the fall itself.
If there's anything worth taking away from this, it's not really about climbing gear, even though double-checking your locking carabiners is obviously important. It's about what happens when we let impatience and ego override the instincts of the people we're supposed to trust most, and it's about how dangerous it is to keep performing that everything is fine for an audience when the two people actually living the moment both know that it isn't. June 12th, 2021. A Saturday morning in Yosemite Valley, California, where clear skies, cool early temperatures, and calm winds created conditions that appeared nearly ideal for a summer day beneath the granite walls of El Capitan. Amarian Varelis was 34 years old and worked as a marketing coordinator for a wellness company in Sacramento, California. She lived alone, had a steady office job, and spent most of her free time focused on fitness.
That's just a normal person's life. A good one, honestly.
During the week, her routine was pretty consistent. Work, the gym, then sharing her progress on social media. On weekends, she'd usually head out to hike the maintained trails around Northern California. The people who knew her described her as disciplined, ambitious, and always looking for ways to challenge herself. That was a big part of her identity. Her posts often talked about pushing past your limits and believing that personal growth came from doing things that felt difficult. By every measure, she was a healthy and experienced recreational hiker. But there was one important thing she wasn't. Amarian wasn't a technical climber. There was no record of her doing indoor climbing, outdoor rock climbing, bouldering, or any kind of rope descent. Aside from the occasional Class 3 hike, she had no documented experience on steep granite, using climbing gear, or navigating terrain where one mistake could quickly become impossible to recover from.
Not even a bouldering gym. nothing.
Yet in just a matter of weeks, one Netflix movie completely changed the way she saw climbing. But in the weeks leading up to June 12th, something started to change. Amarian had been watching a newly released Netflix movie about a fictional big wall climber, and she didn't just watch it once. She watched it over and over for several days, and the more she watched it, the more convinced she became that climbing wasn't nearly as difficult as people claimed. She wasn't just entertained by it, she began treating it like proof. Every time the fictional climber overcame another obstacle through determination alone, it reinforced what she already wanted to believe, that people made climbing sound far more difficult than it really was. Instead of seeing a scripted story built around dramatic moments, she saw confirmation that confidence could overcome obstacles people insisted required years of training. The more she watched, the less climbing looked like a technical discipline, and the more it looked like a test of mindset. Before long, she started posting about it online. She argued that the climbing community made the sport sound harder than it really was, mostly to keep other people out. Experienced climbers, in her view, had built an image of climbing as something only a select few could do. The more people warned about danger, the more convinced she became that those warnings were protecting an exclusive community rather than protecting inexperienced people. To her, all the ropes, gear, years of training, and climbing classes felt like gatekeeping more than actual safety measures.
I can see how that framing starts to simplify something that's actually built on layers of hard-earned experience.
She genuinely believed the biggest difference between experienced climbers and everyone else wasn't years of training. It was simply having the confidence to try. And she wasn't about to let a bunch of experts tell her otherwise. That belief developed during a period of personal frustration. Amarian had recently received a difficult professional performance review, which she believed reflected institutional bias rather than her actual abilities. Clearly a personal attack from someone who just didn't understand her unique talents. The fictional story's central theme that determination alone could overcome an establishment that underestimated capable people became personally meaningful to her.
I'm not mocking that connection, but it was a fictional character on fictional rock.
She told several acquaintances that she intended to travel to Yosemite that weekend to accomplish something significant, though she did not explain that she intended to climb El Capitan without ropes or climbing experience because, frankly, it was nobody's business but her own. 6 days before the trip, she purchased a pair of La Sportiva climbing shoes through an online retailer after comparing her street shoe size with an online fitting guide. No other climbing equipment was purchased or documented.
One pair of shoes. That was enough because, in her mind, the shoes represented the only piece she believed she'd be missing.
Everything else, years of practice, instruction, and technical systems she'd already convinced herself, were obstacles invented by other climbers rather than necessities. The environmental conditions on the morning of June 12th offered little indication of danger to a visitor unfamiliar with technical climbing. At 7 o'clock, the temperature on the valley floor measured 61 degrees Fahrenheit beneath a cloudless sky, with a light southwest wind of approximately 4 miles per hour. Forecasts called for afternoon highs, near 84 degrees, with low humidity and no precipitation. From the meadows below, El Capitan appeared sharply illuminated in the morning sun, while its lower granite slabs rose gradually enough to resemble steep hiking terrain rather than the beginning of one of the most technically demanding climbing objectives in North America.
I've stood in that meadow. It genuinely looks manageable from down there.
But that first impression can be really misleading. Getting onto the wall actually isn't that difficult. The loose rocks at the base are easy enough to cross, and the lower granite slabs can even be walked on in regular shoes. At first, it can feel like the climb is completely manageable. The problem is that it doesn't stay that way for long. Within about the first 100 feet, the angle changes dramatically.
I'm looking at that transition point, and it's almost abrupt how the terrain just stops behaving like the start.
What started as something you could walk across quickly turns into steep, exposed rock, where every move takes real climbing skills that usually come from years of experience. Yosemite rescue teams know this all too well. Just because someone makes it through the first part of the wall doesn't mean they're prepared for what comes next. The favorable weather at sunrise could also be misleading. Experienced climbing parties often begin early to take advantage of the cooler morning hours, knowing that the south-facing granite will spend the day absorbing direct sunlight. By early afternoon, the rock surface can become far hotter than the surrounding air, while the wall offers almost no shade, no accessible water, and few places to rest. Heat, dehydration, and fatigue steadily compound every decision to continue upward. The climbing itself changes just as quickly as the environment. Broad friction slabs give way to smaller edges and isolated footholds, where progress depends on precise foot placement, balance, and body positioning rather than strength alone. Specialized climbing shoes help only when paired with the experience to interpret how the rubber grips the rock. Amarian's shoes had been purchased only days earlier and had never been used on granite, leaving her without the familiarity or technical skill that experienced climbers rely upon to move safely. The part of the wall Amarian was heading toward has caught people off guard before. From the ground, it actually looks like the climb gets easier for a while before becoming steep again farther up. For someone without climbing experience, that can be enough to keep moving higher, thinking the hard part is over.
I can see how that visual illusion would be enough to push someone just a little further without questioning it.
But that's the trap. By the time the wall makes it obvious you're in over your head, getting back down is often harder than going up. And without ropes, anchors, or someone climbing with you, every extra foot off the ground leaves you with fewer and fewer safe options. Amarian arrived at the El Capitan Meadow pullout early that morning after driving from a budget motel in El Portal, about 8 miles west of Yosemite Valley, where she'd spent the night. She was wearing athletic clothes and carrying a small hydration pack with about 32 ounces of water, a protein bar, and a brand new pair of La Sportiva climbing shoes she'd bought just a few days earlier. Sitting on a boulder near the parking area, she took off her trail runners and put on the climbing shoes. Before leaving the meadow, she stopped to take a few photos with El Capitan behind her, its southeast face already lit up by the morning sun. Those pictures, later recovered from her phone, would help investigators pinpoint where she was just before she walked toward the wall.
She looked excited in those photos. You can see it.
She then followed the informal use trail leading from the meadow toward the talus field beneath the southeast face. The route winds through open forest before climbing over large, uneven boulders that require careful footing and occasional use of the hands for balance. Along the way, she passed 2 photographers positioned near the trail to photograph climbers on El Capitan. Neither recalled anything unusual about her appearance or behavior.
I think about those 2 guys a lot. They had no way of knowing.
A person in athletic clothing carrying a small day pack toward the wall on a summer morning was not by itself remarkable. After roughly 40 minutes of hiking and scrambling across the talus, Amarian reached the base of the granite wall, where the gradual lower slabs marked the beginning of the terrain she intended to climb. At the base of El Capitan, a team of 3 experienced climbers from the San Francisco Bay Area was already preparing for a multi-day ascent of the nose route. As they organized ropes and climbing hardware, one member noticed Amarian studying the wall. What immediately stood out was what she was not carrying. She wore no harness or helmet, carried no rope or climbing rack, and her climbing shoes appeared brand new. Her small hydration pack looked more appropriate for a day hike than a technical climb. One of the climbers grew concerned and walked over to ask if she was meeting a partner or a guide.
That climber had every reason to just get on with his own day.
Amarian just scoffed and said she was climbing alone, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The climber tried to explain that once she got past the lower slabs, the wall became extremely dangerous without ropes or technical climbing experience, but she barely seemed interested. She waved the warning off and pointed to a recently released Netflix climbing movie, saying it had convinced her the sport wasn't nearly as difficult as climbers claimed. Seeing climbing as gatekeeping gave her an explanation that protected her confidence. If experienced climbers were exaggerating the danger to keep ordinary people out, then every warning became evidence that she was right. Their concern no longer sounded like concern at all. To her, it sounded like experienced climbers trying to defend an image that only people like them belonged on walls like El Capitan. Her lack of experience wasn't something to worry about. It became proof that she wasn't trapped by the same limiting beliefs they were. The conversation became increasingly tense as the climber, clearly not getting the message, continued urging her to reconsider. Amarian interpreted the warnings as a personal affront and an attempt to keep her off the wall, accusing the group of protecting their status within the climbing community. She then threatened to report them to park rangers for harassment and discrimination, demanding to speak to their manager.
I genuinely don't know what to do with that reaction. They walked over to help her.
With that, she ended the discussion, turned toward the granite, and began climbing, confident that she knew best. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, one member of the climbing party immediately contacted Yosemite Dispatch to report an unroped climber attempting El Capitan without visible safety equipment or technical gear. Rangers were notified, but the report also marked the beginning of a difficult reality. By the time help could be organized, Amarian was already moving higher above the ground. The first section of the wall consisted of low-angle friction slabs, steep enough to demand careful movement but shallow enough that upward progress remained possible without technical climbing, at least initially. Amarian kept her body close to the granite, occasionally placing both palms against the rock for balance as she tested each foothold before committing her weight. Her pace was slow and deliberate, but she continued gaining elevation. The climbers at the base watched in growing concern. Nearby photographers, noticing the activity below, redirected their cameras toward the lower face. Images taken during this period show Amarian moving cautiously across the pale granite, pausing frequently as the angle gradually increased.
I can picture those pauses standing out more clearly in the photos than they probably felt in the moment.
Her new climbing shoes provided grip, but not the experience needed to use them effectively. Having never been broken in or tested on rock, they offered little of the familiarity and tactile feedback experienced climbers rely upon to judge friction and adjust their balance. On the lower slabs, where the angle remained relatively forgiving, that limitation was enough to slow her progress but not stop it.
If it were me, I'd probably still be moving too, just because nothing has forced me to stop yet.
Within the first hour of the climb, Amarian had worked her way to roughly 90 feet above the talus, well beyond the point where simply stepping back down would remain straightforward. The higher Amarian climbed, the more the wall began to change. What had started as broad granite slabs slowly disappeared, replaced by much steeper rock. Now every step had to land on tiny edges, and every move had to be just right. It wasn't something you could simply power through anymore. It took balance, precision, and experience. She was also starting to tire, and those brand new climbing shoes still weren't something she was used to. She slipped twice.
2 slips above 100 feet without a rope. My stomach dropped just reading that.
Neither time turned into a fall, but they were close calls. Ironically, surviving those slips may have reinforced the belief that she'd been right all along. She had made mistakes that should have convinced her to turn around, yet she was still on the wall. Instead of reading those moments as warnings, it would have been easy to see them as proof that she could keep handling whatever came next. She caught herself by throwing both hands against the granite and scrambling to get her feet back underneath her. The rough rock scraped up her palms, injuries that would later show up in photos taken from the valley below. Even then, she didn't stop. Every foot she climbed made the decision harder to reverse. Turning back no longer meant simply climbing down, it meant undoing every difficult move she'd already struggled through. Without ropes or any real climbing experience, retreat may have felt even more dangerous than continuing. Continuing felt dangerous. Retreating felt impossible, so she kept going.
The logic makes a terrible kind of sense. Both directions felt dangerous, so she picked up.
About 230 feet above the base of the wall, she finally reached a spot where she couldn't just keep climbing. The route straight ahead suddenly looked much steeper, with almost nowhere obvious to grab onto. She stood on a ledge only a few inches wide, facing the wall with both hands pressed against the granite. She paused. For a few seconds, it looked like she was thinking about crossing to the right, but then she changed her mind. Instead, she started moving upward and slightly to the left, onto even steeper rock. Above roughly 230 feet, Amarian entered a section of the southeast face that experienced climbers generally avoid.
In my view, when a section has that kind of reputation, it's usually because it doesn't give you any margin for hesitation.
The granite became steeper, more broken, and offered fewer reliable features for hands and feet. Unlike the standard climbing routes nearby, this section provided almost no usable ledges where a climber could stand comfortably and rest. Every movement required continuous balance, muscle engagement, and concentration. Her pace slowed dramatically. Over the next 45 minutes, she gained only about 180 feet, pausing repeatedly to study the rock before each move. Photographs taken from the valley floor during this period consistently show her pressed close against the granite with both hands and both feet in contact with the wall. As the morning progressed, the southeast face became fully exposed to the sun. The granite warmed, the light wind offered little relief, and the growing height beneath her made every movement increasingly consequential. By then, Amarian was more than 400 feet above the talus with no simple route back to the ground. After getting the earlier report, park rangers made their way to the base of the wall and spotted Amarian high above them. They immediately called for a technical rescue team. But a rescue on El Capitan isn't something that can happen in a matter of minutes. Even if rescuers had reached the top immediately, they still couldn't simply pull her to safety. They first had to build anchors, rig hundreds of feet of rope, and descend to wherever she happened to be. Every minute mattered, but the rescue could only work if she stayed where she was. From the ground, the rangers kept calling up to Amarian, telling her to stay exactly where she was and wait for the rescue team. They repeated the instructions several times.
They're shouting up 400 feet of open granite. I keep thinking about how small those voices must have sounded.
But she didn't stay put. Whether she believed she could still climb out on her own or simply didn't think the situation was as serious as everyone else did, she kept trying to move. For more than an hour though, she remained almost exactly where she was, about 410 feet above the talus. Photos taken from the valley floor show only small changes in her position. Most of the time, she stayed pressed against the granite, unable to make any real progress either up or down. By then, she had exhausted the 32 ounces of water she had brought with her.
32 ounces in full sun on hot granite in June.
The southeast face was fully exposed to the late morning sun, leaving her on hot granite without shade, without water, and without any practical place to rest. She remained more than 400 feet above the talus without water, climbing equipment, or any practical route down. Rangers continued calling for her to remain where she was, while the technical rescue team worked into position above, but no one could reach her from the ground. Photographs from this period show her almost motionless against the granite, likely stewing over the incompetence of the park staff for not getting to her sooner. Shortly before noon, Amarian began climbing again. Rather than attempting to descend, as any reasonable person would, she continued upward, moving cautiously across increasingly steep granite, convinced that she knew better than the rangers below. Over the next 20 minutes, Amarian somehow climbed another 60 feet, but by now, the wall had changed completely. It was almost vertical, and every move depended on tiny edges, thin cracks in the granite, and small footholds that were easy to miss. She couldn't see the next move before making the last one. She had to shift her weight first, then search for somewhere, anywhere to place a hand or a foot.
Somehow, she kept going. I'm not going to pretend I don't feel how tight that progression is getting just hearing it described.
By the time she reached roughly 470 feet above the talus, though, she had nowhere left to go. The granite above her offered no obvious holds. She was standing on a strip of rock only a few inches wide, with both palms pressed flat against the wall just to stay balanced. She wasn't holding on to anything anymore. She was simply trying to stay on the wall.
There is no movement left in this posture, only effort to not slip.
Later, after reviewing photographs taken from the valley floor, a climbing consultant concluded that she'd reached a position where there was no practical way to continue without technical climbing equipment. Shortly after noon on June 12th, Amarian Varelis fell from the southeast face of El Capitan. Investigators later estimated she fell from somewhere between 460 and 480 feet above the talus below. The fall was witnessed by two park rangers, a member of the climbing party who had spoken with her earlier that morning, and a photographer documenting the incident from the valley floor. The photographer's camera captured the fall in a sequence of images that was later submitted to investigators as part of the official review. The photographic sequence is consistent with an initial foot slip followed almost immediately by the loss of both hand contacts. There is no indication of a prolonged slide or an attempt to regain control after the initial loss of balance. She separated from the wall and entered freefall.
I'm not going to add anything here. I'll just let that sit.
Investigators determined that her trajectory carried her away from the granite before striking the wall lower down, followed by a final impact on the talus field below. The entire fall lasted only a matter of seconds. Park rangers reached her within minutes, with emergency medical personnel arriving shortly afterward. Amarian was pronounced dead at the scene. Following the incident, Yosemite's technical rescue team secured the base of El Capitan, while investigators began standard documentation of the scene. Witness statements were collected from the climbing party that had spoken with Amarian before she started climbing, the park rangers who monitored the incident from below, the meadow photographer who documented much of the ascent, and other visitors who had observed portions of the event. The photographer voluntarily provided the complete sequence of images captured throughout the morning, allowing investigators to reconstruct Amarian's movements on the wall with unusual precision. Dispatch logs also confirmed that concerns about an unroped climber had been reported hours before the fall, and that a technical rescue response had already been initiated, though the complexity of organizing a high-angle rescue on El Capitan prevented rescuers from reaching her position before the incident occurred. The regional medical examiner's office conducted a full post-mortem examination. The findings documented multiple catastrophic blunt force injuries involving the head, spine, chest, pelvis, and internal organs, consistent with a high-altitude fall involving secondary impact with the granite wall before the final impact on the talus below. Toxicology testing detected no alcohol, prescription medications, or illicit substances that would have impaired judgment or coordination.
Not that it changes anything, but it gets asked in every case, so it gets answered.
The manner of death was certified as accidental, and the cause of death was listed as multiple blunt force injuries sustained during an unroped fall from El Capitan. The investigative review found no evidence of rockfall, unstable terrain beyond the normal conditions of the route, equipment malfunction, criminal conduct, or third-party involvement. Instead, investigators concluded that the incident resulted from an attempt to climb technical granite terrain without the specialized skills, protective equipment, or climbing systems required for that environment. The review further noted that Amarian had continued into progressively steeper sections of the wall after repeated opportunities to turn back and despite direct warnings from experienced climbers before leaving the ground. No criminal charges or civil enforcement actions were taken, and park officials issued only a routine public notice confirming a fatal climbing incident within Yosemite Valley. September 19th, 2020. That's the date everything in this story actually started moving, but honestly, the seeds were planted weeks before that, sitting in a glow of a phone screen. Zara Colley and John DeRosa, a couple in their early 40s, had decided they were going to climb the east face of Half Dome in Yosemite, not the cables route. Not the thing literally tens of thousands of people do every single year with a permit and a steel cable to hang on to. No, they wanted something more exclusive. And the way they did their research was, get this, TikTok and drone footage. That's it. That was the extent of their due diligence for one of the more technical alpine rock faces in California.
When I read the report that they called the cable route demeaning and overcrowded, like it was beneath them or something, I just sat back in my chair.
There's a kind of person who sees a safety system used by regular families and retirees and thinks, that's not for me, I need something more cinematic. And look, I get wanting an adventure. I really do. But the moment you start treating a mountain like a backdrop for your personal brand instead of a genuinely dangerous piece of granite that doesn't care who you are, you've already lost the plot. Zara had inherited a company from her family, and John used to be her yoga instructor before they got together. Two people with money and time, but apparently zero humility about what they were walking into.
So you might be thinking, how do two people with no technical climbing background end up on a real trade route?
Well, they found a guy named Rio Chavez through a Craigslist ad. The ad literally said, private rock instruction. Not a registered guide service, not someone affiliated with any of the legitimate outfits that operate in Yosemite under permit, just a guy on Craigslist. Rio, it turns out, was operating as an unauthorized commercial climbing instructor, completely outside the legal permitting system the park requires. He had no wilderness first responder certification, which is something even moderately serious guides usually carry. He had about 2 years of experience transitioning from gym climbing to actual outdoor rock, what people in the climbing world sometimes call gym to crag. 2 years. That's barely enough time to get truly comfortable with your own gear, let alone be responsible for two complete strangers on an alpine wall.
Here's the thing that gets me every time I think about this case. All of these red flags were sitting there right in plain sight before a single dollar changed hands.
No certification, no legal standing to operate, limited experience, and Zara and John looked at all of it and thought, sure, let's wire this guy a small fortune. During their first phone call with Rio, he was actually pretty upfront, which I'll give him credit for in this one moment. He told them straight out that the east face route had no bolts, no fixed safety lines, and would require placing trad gear the whole way up, meaning cams and nuts wedged into cracks rather than the bolted anchors you'd find on a sport climb. He also told them flatly that the route turns lethal in afternoon thunderstorms, which is an extremely common weather pattern in the Sierra in the late summer. He even recommended a simpler alpine route instead, something more appropriate for their experience level, and Zara cut him off mid-sentence. She told him they were paying for solutions, not obstacles. Now that phrase tells you everything about how this entire trip was going to go.
When you treat a mountain guide's professional warning as an obstacle to be paid around instead of information that might keep you alive, you've already decided the outcome doesn't apply to you.
It's the kind of thinking that works great in business negotiations and falls apart completely the second gravity gets involved. They ended up negotiating a flat fee of $25,000 wired up front for a 2-day private climb. And Rio, despite knowing full well he had never personally led that exact route before and only owned a single rack of cams, which is honestly a pretty bare-bones equipment setup for a route like this, said yes. He took the money. And look, I'm not going to pretend like $25,000 is not a life-changing amount of money for a lot of people. When you're staring at that kind of payout, your judgment about your own limitations can get real foggy real fast. Before the trip even started, Zara and John went shopping, and this is where the story starts to feel almost like dark comedy if it didn't end the way it did. They went to an upscale outdoor retailer and bought ultralight Wiregate carabiners, ultralight daisy chains, and a pair of signature model climbing shoes that were a full size too small.
Now you might be thinking, for someone so rich, why use something too small? Well, according to them, it's because they looked sleeker.
They skipped the entire break-in period that climbing shoes need, where you wear them around to stretch the material and get a feel for them before committing to a multi-day technical climb in them. They also bought a drone and a professional camera rig, which added about 8 extra pounds to their packs. 8 pounds might not sound like much until you're hanging off a granite slab at 4,000 feet of exposure, and every single ounce matters for your balance and your energy reserves.
The shoe thing bothers me more than almost anything else in this whole story, and that's saying something given how it ends.
Climbing shoes that don't fit aren't just uncomfortable. They actively impair your ability to trust your footwork on technical terrain, which is exactly the skill you need most on a slab route like this. They chose looking good in photos over being able to safely stand on rock. That's the whole trip in one purchase. Rio sent them a mandatory gear list ahead of time. 4 liters of water per person, helmets, headlamps, warm layers for the exposed sections. Zara deleted the email. She just deleted it. John instead packed only 1 liter of water each for the entire approach and climb, explaining this away as weight efficiency. Meanwhile, he made room in his own pack for an expensive bottle of whiskey, intended for a summit toast. So water was expendable, but the celebratory drink was non-negotiable.
I don't know what else to say about that, except that it tells you exactly where their priorities sat.
They also turned down Rio's offer of a pre-hike practice session at a local crag, a nearby cliff where beginners typically get comfortable with gear, rope systems, and basic movement before attempting something bigger. Zara said their athletic backgrounds covered it. Her athletic background, for context, was spin class. John's was recreational basketball. Now, I do hoop sometimes, but these activities do not prepare your hands, your feet, or your nervous system for vertical granite.
This is the part where, if I were a friend of theirs, I would have begged them to reconsider.
Confidence built on the wrong foundation is maybe the most dangerous thing you can bring onto a mountain. The evening before the climb actually began was already a mess. They arrived at the Yosemite trailhead 3 hours late, and the reason was almost unbelievable. John had insisted on taking a scenic detour specifically to capture drone footage along the way. Rio had been waiting since dawn. Think about that. He lost an entire chunk of his planned preparation time. Daylight he needed to brief them, check gear, and mentally walk through the route. Also, John could get some aerial shots of scenery on the drive in. At the ranger station, things got worse. They lied to the rangers about their intended route, claiming they were doing the standard cables hike, specifically to dodge the permit check that would have applied to their actual technical climbing plan. Rio, who absolutely should have known better given this was his profession, went along with the lie.
That moment right there is, to me, the closest and clearest evidence that Rio had already lost control of this relationship with his clients.
He wasn't guiding them. He was being steered by them. And he let it happen because $25,000 was already sitting in his account. Once they got to the campground, Zara complained that it was too primitive and insisted they sleep in their rented luxury SUV instead of setting up camp properly. So the night before attempting a serious technical climb, they got cramped, broken sleep in the front and back seats of an SUV, compounded by John's snoring.
I don't think I need to explain why that's a bad way to prepare your body for a physically demanding day.
Climbing fatigue isn't just about the day of. It compounds from the moment you stop resting properly, and these two walked into day 1 already running on empty. That night, Rio laid out a detailed plan. Wake up at 4 in the morning, move fast and efficient, reach the base of the east face by 9, summit by noon. Be on the way back down before 2 in the afternoon, specifically to beat the afternoon lightning that builds reliably in that part of the Sierra. It was a smart, conservative plan built around the single biggest danger of this whole route, which was the weather window. Zara laughed it off and said they'd start at 8 instead, because sunrise photos were, in her words, non-negotiable. And Rio, again, just relented. This moment reveals the disaster taking shape. By delaying their start on a route known for dangerous afternoon storms, Rio and Zara gave up the very safety margin that could have protected them, all for sunrise photos they could have taken elsewhere. They then left 45 minutes later than Zara's already delayed plan because she spent time doing her makeup and arranging her hair for photos. On the approach, Zara repeatedly stopped to adjust painfully tight climbing shoes, then refused Rio's suggestion to switch to comfortable hiking shoes because she thought it would waste time, even though the repeated delays cost them far more time. Meanwhile, John was treating the entire hike like a film shoot. He flew his drone directly over Rio's head while Rio was working, at one point causing Rio to duck suddenly and nearly drop one of his cams, a piece of climbing protection that, if damaged or lost, could have left them under-equipped for the technical sections above. John just laughed it off and called it content.
I bring this up because it's such a small moment, but it tells you so much about the power dynamic on this trip.
Rio was the professional, the one whose judgment they were supposedly paying for, and he was being treated like a prop in someone else's video. Then they ran into a group of experienced climbers coming down from a different route, and these climbers warned them directly about unstable weather building over the Sierra crest. This is a real, documented kind of trail encounter. Climbers descending often pass along weather intel to people heading up because conditions in alpine terrain change fast, and visibility from below isn't always reliable. Rio heard this and immediately pushed for a turnaround. John's response was to dismiss the warning entirely, suggesting those climbers simply weren't fit enough to continue.
I don't even know what to say to that one. It wasn't a fitness issue, it was a weather issue.
John just didn't want to hear it, so he reframed it into something he could dismiss. By 11 in the morning, they were already running low on water, which should surprise absolutely no one, given they'd each brought only 1 liter for a full day in the sun on exposed granite. Rio offered up half of his own remaining water, and Zara drank it without so much as a thank you, then complained that it tasted like plastic. Can you imagine if you were in Rio's position? This man was giving up his own hydration on a route where dehydration directly affects grip strength, judgment, and reaction time, and the response was a complaint about taste. There's a kind of person who simply cannot register when someone else is doing them a favor, and I think we were looking at 2 of them. Rio kept pointing out the darkening cumulus clouds building to the west, and he suggested, more than once at this point, that they abort and reschedule for the next day. Zara's response was to remind him that they had already paid and that $25,000 in her mind bought them a weather exception. They finally reached the base of the east face slab at 1:20 in the afternoon, more than 4 hours behind Rio's original schedule. Rio checked his satellite messenger device for an updated forecast. That's not a subtle shift. That's the kind of number that should end a climb on the spot for any responsible guide. Rio proposed bailing again. John accused him of trying to take their money without delivering the experience they paid for.
And Rio, faced with that accusation and the financial pressure hanging over him, caved.
The climbing began around 1:30 in the afternoon, leaving them with even less time before the usual afternoon weather. Rio led the first pitch, placing traditional protection and building a secure anchor before bringing Zara and John up one at a time. Zara refused to wear a helmet, struggled throughout the pitch, and incorrectly clipped her personal anchor system to a gear loop instead of her harness's belay loop. Although Rio immediately told her to fix it, she brushed him off and never corrected it. John then reached the anchor and clipped himself to a single bolt instead of the fully equalized anchor Rio had built. When Rio arrived after cleaning the route, he found both clients relying on the same single anchor point with no redundancy. He immediately resecured them correctly, but they complained that he was micromanaging them.
Now, before I go any further, I need you to understand that this single anchor situation is honestly one of the most quietly terrifying details in the entire story.
An anchor is supposed to be redundant specifically because any one point can fail, whether from gear placement, rock quality, or equipment wear. 2 adults paying clients on a serious alpine route were both clipped into one bolt on a slick mossy ledge, and their reaction to being corrected was irritation rather than gratitude. At this point, I don't think they understood, even on some basic level, that the rope and the gear were the only thing standing between them and a 200-foot fall. They were treating safety procedure like an inconvenience imposed by an overly cautious employee. Rio then led the second pitch, a steeper, more polished slab section with marginal friction, meaning the rock surface didn't offer much grip for hands or feet. He placed 2 small cams and a marginal nut along the way, gear that wasn't ideal but was what the rock allowed. At the top, he built a belay anchor, relying on an old 1/4-inch bolt, an outdated and weaker style of bolt than what's used in modern climbing anchors, backed up by a single marginal cam. He knew this anchor wasn't great. He decided to trust it anyway, because of the time pressure that had been building all day thanks to the 4-hour late start. Rio then belayed Zara up that pitch. Her too tight shoes caused her arch to cramp violently about halfway up, and she froze completely, yelling down at Rio for choosing such a footwork-intensive route, as if the rock itself had personally wronged her by requiring precise foot placement. Rio lowered her a few feet to a small foothold so she could rest. While she sat there cramping for about 10 minutes, John shouted up impatiently from below, telling her to push through it. Not concern, not patience. Impatience, because they were behind schedule, the schedule they themselves had blown up that morning over sunrise photos. By 3 in the afternoon, thunder was rumbling from the west, and the storm was now only about 10 miles away, which in mountain terms is uncomfortably close, especially with more thunder following close behind. Rio announced a mandatory retreat at this point, no longer a suggestion. Zara wanted to push to the next ledge instead, specifically for a better photo looking down into the valley. John backed her up, insisting they were almost there, even though they were only about 1/3 of the way up the actual route. Rio tried to explain, as clearly as he could, that lightning striking exposed granite is a fatal scenario, full stop. John responded with the idea that their rubber-soled climbing shoes would somehow insulate them from a lightning strike. This is not true. Rubber soles offer no meaningful protection from a lightning strike on an exposed rock face, and the fact that John believed this and stated it with confidence tells you just how little actual research had gone into this trip from the very beginning. Rio, by his own later account, was stunned into silence by that comment.
I don't blame him. I think I would have been too.
Rio then proposed an alternative. He would solo climb, meaning climb without being roped to anyone for that section, up to the next anchor point, fix a rope there, and then lower both of them down safely from that position. It was a reasonable plan to get them off the wall before the storm arrived. Zara vetoed it immediately, because rappelling down meant no summit, and in her mind, they hadn't paid $25,000 for a failure. She insisted on pushing for one more pitch instead. This is where Rio actually drew a line, for once. He told them flatly that he would not continue, and Zara's response was to threaten to fire him on the spot, write a damaging review, and remind him very specifically that his liability waiver was flimsy and that she happened to know a lawyer. Rio, who was terrified of financial ruin given that he was already operating illegally without proper authorization, relented yet again. Rio led the third pitch anyway, a thin crack section with genuinely poor protection options. He managed to place a single small cam, a size that climbers would call .75, into rock that was flaring, meaning the crack widened in a way that made the gear less secure than it would be in a parallel-sided crack. He reached a stance and built an anchor again, relying on an old 1/4-inch bolt, the same outdated style as before, backed up by another marginal cam. He brought Zara up to that anchor first. By 4:15 in the afternoon, Zara arrived at Rio's new anchor, completely exhausted, dehydrated from the lack of water all day, and her previously cramping foot was now spasming on and off. Rio told her clearly to clip into the bolt using her personal anchor system and just wait there while he prepared to bring John up next. That instruction was simple, and it should have been the easiest thing in the world to follow. But Zara, impatient and in real physical pain at this point, decided on her own, without asking Rio, to unclip from the anchor so she could shift a few feet to the right, to a stance that felt more comfortable. In her haste, she twisted the sleeve of her locking carabiner, but never fully screwed it shut, meaning the supposed safety lock on that carabiner wasn't actually engaged. As she leaned over to that new position, her foot slipped on a section of polished granite, the kind of smooth, glassy rock surface that offers almost no friction. She stumbled forward and grabbed for the anchor bolt with her free hand. Her carabiner gate brushed against the bolt hanger in the process, but never actually clipped onto it. In that instant, she was completely untethered, standing on a 45-degree slab with no real handhold to grab. John had just arrived at the stance directly below her right as this was happening, and he saw her losing her balance. He lunged upward across a 3-foot gap, trying to grab her by the waistband to stop her from falling. But his own daisy chain was still clipped into the lower anchor, and as he lunged, it wrapped around his right leg and twisted his harness into what's essentially a bind, locking his leg in an awkward position. While he was trying to untwist himself from that bind, he shifted his weight onto a loose flake of rock, a section that looked solid but wasn't actually attached securely to the wall behind it. The flake broke off under his boot. He pitched sideways and in doing so pulled Zara by her jacket as he fell. Both of them slid downward across the slab together. Zara's open carabiner offered no actual connection to anything solid, and John's daisy chain, twisted around his leg, was the only thing still attached to a fixed point, that lower old 1/4-inch bolt. As they slid, that daisy chain went taut, suddenly taking the combined weight of both of their bodies plus all their gear in what's called a shock load, an extremely violent, sudden force far beyond what a static load would produce. The old 1/4-inch bolt, already a weaker and outdated piece of hardware, failed instantly under that force. From there, they tumbled past the second anchor point and past the other gear Rio had placed along the route, pieces that were already widely spaced and only marginally secure to begin with. Each one sequentially pulled out of its flaring placement as the force of the fall traveled through the rope and gear system. They fell freely for about 80 feet down the slab, striking several small ledges along the way, before finally coming to rest on a wide, flat talus slope roughly 200 feet below the route. Neither one of them was moving. Rio was still up at the anchor for the third pitch when all of this happened, and he watched the entire sequence unfold from above, completely unable to do anything about it. He had just unclipped his own belay device to prepare for the next transition, which meant there was zero tension on the rope to catch either of them. He screamed, but there was no one else within earshot to help. Rio reportedly froze in place for about 12 minutes after the fall, which honestly doesn't surprise me given what he had just witnessed. Eventually, he made a panicked mayday call using his satellite communication device. Search and rescue arrived by helicopter roughly 2 hours later, and by that point, lightning had actually moved into the area, which significantly hampered the rescue operation. The bodies were recovered at dusk that evening. I think about Rio sitting up on that ledge for those 2 hours, alone, having just watched two people he had spent the last day with fall to their deaths.
Honestly, whatever frustration I have with how he handled the lead up to this trip, I don't think anyone deserves to carry that alone on the side of a mountain.
The autopsy results confirmed that both Zara and John died from blunt force trauma sustained in the fall. John's neck was broken. Zara suffered massive internal injuries. Investigators who examined their harnesses afterward found incorrect clipping configurations and webbing that showed clear wear from the slide down the rock face, physical evidence matching exactly what Rio later described happening in those final minutes. The investigation that followed uncovered the full picture of how illegitimate this whole operation had been from the start. Rio had no authorization whatsoever to operate as a commercial climbing guide within Yosemite National Park. Investigators traced the entire arrangement back to that original Craigslist ad and the $25,000 wire transfer that started it all. Rio ended up facing manslaughter charges, which were later reduced through a plea bargain down to charges of criminal negligence. The families of Zara and John pursued a lawsuit against him afterward, but by that point there was essentially nothing left to collect. The money from the climb itself had already gone toward paying off Rio's own personal debts, long before any of this ever reached a courtroom. August 9th, 2019. The Havasupai Reservation in northwestern Arizona sits deep inside a canyon system where the landscape itself becomes part of the danger. Massive sandstone walls rise hundreds of feet on either side and trap heat instead of letting it escape. By mid-morning in August, temperatures on the canyon floor regularly climb above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Those temperatures are recorded on the main trail where there are water sources and other hikers nearby. Getting into Havasupai is not as simple as buying a ticket at the entrance. Visitors need a permit that must be secured months in advance through the tribe's online reservation system. Most years, the available permits are gone within hours. The system is not only meant to limit the number of visitors, the canyon is remote, rescue resources are limited, and officials rely on permit records to know who is in the backcountry and roughly where they should be.
If someone enters without a permit, they're not on any official record. No one's expecting them, and if they don't come back, no one knows to start looking.
By 2019, this was not obscure information. The permit process had been discussed for years on hiking forums, travel blogs, and social media. Anyone who had seriously looked into visiting Havasupai would have known that permits were required. The trip was Sean Falco's idea. He was 26 and had built a fitness page posting workout videos, physique updates, and travel content that framed everything as an adventurous lifestyle. After they missed out on permits, he was the one who suggested going anyway. He was fit, confident, and used to being the most capable person in any room, and he carried that same assumption into environments that had nothing to do with a gym. The strongest athlete of the group was Drew Tilden. He was 25, Sean's closest friend, faster and fitter than most people around him. He had enough outdoor experience to feel comfortable in most situations, but not enough to appreciate how different this canyon could be. He agreed to Sean's plan without much hesitation. Aliyah Reeves had wanted to shoot Havasupai for over a year. She was 24 and had been dating Sean for about that long too. Her page focused almost entirely on carefully edited travel and lifestyle photos, and Havasupai had come up more than once in her content plans. The location was as much her motivation for the trip as anything else. The youngest of the four, Cassidy Weston, had never done a backcountry hike before. before. She was 23 and had been close friends with Alaya since high school. She came because Alaya asked her to, and because on paper, it sounded like an adventure.
Confidence can be surprisingly contagious. Once one person sounds like they know what they're doing, it's a lot easier for everyone around them to go along with it.
The canyon holds onto heat in a way that catches many people off guard. The sandstone walls absorb heat throughout the day and slowly release it after sunset, so temperatures stay high long after the sun goes down. Airflow is limited, and even standing in the shade offers less relief than most people expect, because the surrounding rock continues radiating heat. The human body cools itself by sweating. As sweat evaporates, it carries heat away from the skin. That system only works as long as the body has enough fluid to keep producing sweat. As dehydration sets in, sweat production slows. Once that happens, body temperature begins to rise. The early warning signs can seem minor. A headache, nausea, dizziness, or simply feeling off are easy to brush aside. By the time those symptoms become obvious, the body is often already struggling to keep up. In a canyon that can reach 110 degrees with little airflow and limited shade, that decline can happen much faster than people realize.
I've heard people describe desert hiking as a game of just staying ahead of your own body. Once your body starts falling behind, there's often no quick way to fix it.
Beyond the main Havasu Creek route, an unauthorized side canyon becomes far more rugged. The trails are unmaintained, and much of the terrain is made up of loose, fractured sandstone. From a distance, the rock can look solid. Up close, it is often anything but. Sections that appear stable can break away under a person's weight without warning, and the fracture lines that weaken the rock are usually impossible to see from the surface. Sean had looked into Havasupai permits months before the trip. He knew how it worked, knew when it opened, and knew they had missed their chance after it sold out. Instead of giving up, he spent time reading hiking forums and scrolling through location-tagged posts from people who admitted they had gone in without permits and had no problems. He found enough stories to convince himself the risk was worth taking. He told the others they could probably get onto the trail before anyone questioned whether they had a reservation, and that the worst-case scenario was simply being turned around at the entrance. He sounded confident because he had done research. It just was not the kind of research that accounted for what could happen if something went wrong.
I think we've all fallen into this trap at some point. If enough people say, I did it and nothing happened, it starts feeling a lot safer than it actually is.
Their early start was part of the plan. They drove through the night hoping to reach the trail before anyone questioned whether they had a reservation. By 4:30 in the morning, they were already hiking by headlamp. No one stopped them. For a moment, it probably felt like all the research had paid off. They were carrying more gear than any of them were used to hiking with. Sean and Drew split the drone case and gimbal between their packs, even though drones were prohibited on the reservation without prior approval. Alaya carried 2 camera bodies along with a portable lighting panel. Cassidy carried most of the shared supplies, including water, snacks, and a basic first aid kit that none of them had much experience using. The weight added up quickly, although no one seemed concerned about it.
I doubt any of them were thinking about conserving energy that morning. The gear probably felt like an investment, not something that would eventually work against them.
As they made their way along the permitted section of the trail, they passed other hikers who had also started before sunrise to avoid the worst of the heat. Everyone kept moving. No one questioned why the group was there. At about 6:15 that morning, the group reached a sign marking a side canyon as closed to visitors. Cassidy slowed down long enough to read it and glanced at the others. Sean kept walking without stopping. Drew followed him. Alaya was looking at her phone, checking the location tag she wanted for photos. After a moment, Cassidy followed them. By then, the temperature had already climbed to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and the hottest part of the day was still hours away.
It's easy to look at 86 degrees and think, yeah, we're still good. The worst of the heat isn't here yet. Sometimes that's exactly when you're falling behind.
Alaya had found the exact spot she wanted through a geotagged post from another creator. It was a section of an unauthorized side canyon about 2 miles off the main route, where the morning sun hit the sandstone at just the right angle. That was the destination. Sean's plan was simple. They would get there, film what they needed, and make it back to the main trail before the hottest part of the day. The terrain changed almost as soon as they left the main trail. The maintained trail disappeared, replaced by uneven rock shelves, loose stone, and sections where every step demanded attention. Within the first half mile, the drone case was already becoming a problem. It was bulky and awkward to carry. As Drew squeezed through a narrow section, it caught against the canyon wall and threw him off balance on a patch of loose scree. He caught himself, adjusted the case across his back, and kept going. Sean was already several yards ahead. Cassidy stayed at the back of the group. Unlike the others, she watched every step before putting her weight down. On one short scramble, she stopped completely, studied the route for a moment, and waited until Drew had made it to the top before climbing after him. The others kept moving and never looked back. They reached the location at around 9 that morning. The light was exactly what Alaya had hoped for. The early sun lit the upper canyon wall and reflected down into the narrow canyon below. She immediately started directing the shoot. Sean set up the gimbal while Drew launched the drone. Before long, everyone was focused on getting the next shot. They stayed there for nearly 2 hours. They weren't just taking a few pictures. They kept moving to different spots, reviewing footage, waiting for the light to shift, and redoing shots they thought could look better. Before long, the morning had slipped away.
I can imagine someone saying, let's get one more shot. And nobody's thinking about what another 15 minutes might change.
During that time, they drank water regularly. It did not seem excessive. It was simply what anyone would do while hiking and filming in that kind of heat. But no one was paying attention to how much water they had left. Around 10:30, Cassidy picked up one of the shared bottles, noticed how light it felt, and quietly put it back down. The others were setting up another shot, and she did not want to interrupt. Instead, she finished what remained in her own bottle. By then, they'd already been hiking and filming for more than 6 hours. Even if they'd started with what seemed like plenty of water, they were going through it much faster than they'd expected. They were also eating protein bars throughout the morning. They were calorie dense and familiar to all of them, but digesting food in extreme heat requires additional fluid. On its own, that would not have made much difference. Combined with the miles they had already covered, the heavy packs and hours of constant heat, it became one more demand on bodies that were already under stress. By 11 o'clock, the temperature on the canyon floor was approaching 108 degrees. They had spent more than 4 hours surrounded by direct sunlight and heat radiating off the canyon walls. None of them were dressed for those conditions. They were wearing the same athletic clothes they normally wore to the gym or for fitness content. No one had a wide-brimmed hat, lightweight sun protective clothing, or anything that would have provided meaningful protection in an Arizona canyon in August. There's a big difference between dressing for comfort and dressing for conditions. The canyon wasn't exactly handing out bonus points for looking good though. Instead of turning around, Sean suggested going farther. He had seen another location online, a narrow slot canyon about 1.5 miles deeper into the route. He said they could get a few more shots there before heading back. He said it with the same confidence he had shown all morning, as though the decision had already been made. Drew mentioned that the heat was getting to him. Sean acknowledged it, but kept packing up the gear. Alaya was already looking at the route farther south on her phone, comparing the terrain ahead to the photos she had saved. She did not say much either way. Cassidy quietly suggested that they should start heading back. She was not arguing or trying to stop anyone. She simply thought they had gone far enough. Sean replied that they were already there, and it did not make sense to leave without getting everything they had come for. Drew had already shouldered his pack. Alaya started walking. After a brief pause, Cassidy picked up her pack and followed. The stretch between the two locations was the most difficult part of the route so far. The scrambling became steeper, and the sandstone underfoot was looser and less predictable. They moved much more slowly than they had earlier that morning. They stopped more often, spoke less, and spent most of the hike focused on where to place their feet. Every mile made the heat harder to deal with. The heavy packs, the hours of hiking, and the water they had already lost were all beginning to catch up with them.
I don't think this part looked anything like the trip they pictured. It sounds more like they were grinding through it than really enjoying it.
Around noon, Cassidy said she had a pounding headache and felt like she might throw up. Sean told her to drink some water and keep moving. She unscrewed her bottle, looked inside, and realized there was barely anything left. Someone checked for a phone signal. There was none. They kept going. Nobody suggested stopping for long. At that point, they still believed they could get the last location and be heading back soon. They reached the slot canyon around 12:30. By then, all 4 of them were clearly feeling the effects of the heat. They were moving slowly, sitting down whenever they had the chance, and speaking very little. Between the 4 of them, they had less than a quarter of their water remaining. It started with Drew. On the eastern side of the slot canyon was a sandstone ledge, about 15 feet above the ground. It offered a clear view across the canyon, and Drew climbed toward it without much hesitation. From below, nothing about the ledge stood out as especially dangerous, especially to someone with Drew's experience. He reached the top, raised his camera, and shifted his weight. The rock beneath him suddenly gave way. There was no loud crack or obvious warning. The entire section, roughly 4 feet across, broke free all at once. Sandstone can fail that way because the fractures that weaken it often run deep inside the rock and cannot be seen from the surface. Drew fell with the collapsing slab. He landed on his feet first, then slammed onto his left side before his head struck the canyon floor. Part of the broken rock came down on top of him. His left leg absorbed most of the impact. The tibia snapped with enough force that the broken bone pushed through the skin just below his knee. The rest of the fall left him with serious blunt force injuries to his left shoulder and the left side of his head. By the time Sean and Alaya reached him, he was still conscious, but he was confused and unable to respond clearly. He could only make incoherent sounds, and the area around his left eye was already beginning to swell shut. They managed to lift the rock slab off Drew, but there was little else they could do. Cassidy stayed back near the canyon wall while Sean and Aliyah tried to assess his injuries. None of them had any real medical training. They had nothing sturdy enough to splint his leg, no way to stabilize his head, and no safe way to move him without risking even more damage. Sean pulled out his phone. There was no signal. Drew's phone had been thrown from his pack during the fall. The drone controller had GPS, but it could not contact anyone. The temperature had climbed to 111 degrees Fahrenheit. They were about 2.5 miles beyond the main route in an unmaintained side canyon. There was no marked trail, no shade structures, and no one else anywhere nearby. Because they had entered the reservation without a valid permit, no one outside the group had any official record that they were there.
That detail really got to me. This is why permits matter more than most people realize. Imagine needing help that badly and nobody even knows they're supposed to be looking for you.
There were not many options. Carrying Drew out over that terrain was not realistic, and staying put meant waiting with no way to call for help. Sean made the call. Sean decided that he and Cassidy would head back for help while Aliyah stayed with Drew. Before leaving, Sean propped his backpack against a large rock near Drew so it would be easy to spot from a distance. He took one of the 2 remaining water bottles and left the other with Aliyah. Sean and Cassidy started back just after 1 that afternoon. Sean pushed ahead, stopping whenever Cassidy fell too far behind, but every stretch of exposed rock was taking more out of him. Within about 20 minutes, Cassidy began falling behind. She was no longer sweating the way she had been earlier. When Sean reached out to steady her across a loose section of rock, her skin felt hot and unusually dry. She walked with slow, careful steps and barely spoke. At first, it looked as though she was simply concentrating on the difficult terrain. Soon it became obvious that something else was wrong. Sean was still moving faster than she was. He had been in better physical condition from the start, and he had gone through slightly less water during the morning. Even so, the heat was taking its toll on him as well. He would get ahead, stop to wait for Cassidy, then start moving again. About 40 minutes into the return hike, Cassidy lowered herself onto a flat rock in an exposed section of the canyon with no shade. She said she just needed a minute. Sean handed her the last of the water he was carrying and waited. The bottle was empty after that. After a short rest, she stood up and they continued. 10 minutes later, she sat down again. This time, her breathing was noticeably different. It was quick, shallow, and uneven. Her face had turned a deep red, and when Sean asked if she was okay, she answered slowly. Her words no longer matched his questions. She was still awake and sitting upright, but she was clearly becoming confused. Sean stayed with Cassidy for a while before deciding he had to keep moving if anyone was going to get help. Nearby, he found a small rock overhang that offered the only patch of shade in that stretch of canyon. He helped her into it. He leaned the empty bottle against the rock where it could be seen and left his phone beside her even though it had no signal. Then he continued on alone with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. The remaining hike back to the permitted trail was about 1.5 miles. It took him nearly 1.5 hours to cover it. He moved slowly, stopping often and staying as close to the canyon wall as he could whenever there was even a little shade. By the time he reached a section of trail where a small group of hikers was making their way out, he was in serious distress. He made it as far as a flat section of rock near the trail edge before he stopped moving. A small group of hikers found him there. He was conscious enough to respond when they spoke to him, but could not stand and could not give a clear location for the others. Over the next several minutes, he stopped responding to their voices. He died before emergency responders reached him.
It was the first time anyone outside the group even knew they were in the canyon. There was no permit on file, no entry record, and no expected return time that would have flagged anything as wrong.
The information had to be passed along through others before it reached emergency responders. By then, nearly 2 hours had passed since Drew's fall. Responders arrived to find Sean where the hikers had left him, still in the same position on the rock. Rescuers still faced several more hours before they could reach the group. Ground teams had to make their way through the same unmarked, unmaintained terrain in the same extreme heat, with only a rough idea of where the others might be. The canyon walls were too narrow for a direct landing in most sections, and the extreme heat made flying conditions difficult, so ground teams had to cover much of the distance on foot. There was simply no fast way to reach the group. Back at the Slot Canyon, Aliyah was alone with Drew. Since the fall, he had drifted in and out of consciousness. At times, he seemed to recognize her voice. A few minutes later, he would stop responding again. She used the little water she had left to wet his lips and cool his face, hoping to keep him responsive for as long as possible. Sometime during the afternoon, he stopped responding altogether. Aliyah stayed beside him in the narrow strip of shade along the canyon wall. As the afternoon wore on, even that patch of shade slowly shrank. By then, she had no water left. She had already exhausted herself trying to help Drew after the fall, and now she was sitting for hours in a canyon where the temperature remained well above 100 degrees. There was nowhere she could realistically go, no way to call for help, and no way of knowing whether anyone was even looking for them yet. By mid-afternoon, the narrow strip of shade along the canyon wall had disappeared completely. What happened after that was reconstructed from the scene. At some point, Aliyah had tried to move. She only made it about 20 or 30 feet in the direction of the trail before collapsing. When rescuers reached her, she was lying on the ground facing the way out, only a short distance from where she had stayed with Drew. Drew died in the canyon sometime that afternoon. Aliyah died a few hours later. Cassidy was found where Sean had left her beneath the small rock overhang. The empty water bottle was still propped against the rock, and Sean's phone was lying nearby. She was still alive when ground teams reached her, but she was unresponsive. She was airlifted out of the canyon, but died before she could reach a hospital. Cassidy Weston died from hyperthermia after her core body temperature rose beyond the point her body could recover. Severe dehydration and prolonged exposure to extreme heat without access to water were listed as contributing factors. Drew Tilden died before rescuers could reach him. The fall left him with a compound fracture of his left tibia and a traumatic brain injury caused by blunt force trauma to the left side of his skull. The coroner concluded that the combination of the head injury, blood loss from the open fracture, and prolonged heat exposure made survival unlikely even if help had arrived sooner given how remote the location was. His camera was recovered a few feet from where he fell. The footage ended mid-shot. Aliyah Reeves died from hyperthermia and dehydration. Her phone was recovered beside her. The last photos on it were time-stamped at 11:47 that morning, less than an hour before Drew's fall. Sean Falco died on the trail less than a mile from the main route. The cause was hyperthermia and severe dehydration. He had covered more ground than the others, but had done so in direct sun with no water and nothing to slow the heat working through him. He was found by the hikers who had tried to help him, still sitting where they had left him. Investigators used GPS data from the drone controller, along with timestamps from the group's cameras and phones, to reconstruct their movements and determine how far into the unauthorized side canyon they had traveled. The deaths were ruled accidental. The official findings identified unauthorized entry into the restricted area, an inadequate water supply, and the resulting delay in rescue efforts as the primary factors that contributed to all deaths. The drone itself was never recovered.
I think this story shows that confidence and preparation are not the same thing. You can have plenty of one without nearly enough of the other.
It's June 14th, 2018. The Arkansas River runs through the heart of south-central Colorado, cutting through a canyon called Browns Canyon just outside the small town of Buena Vista. Buena Vista sits at about 8,000 feet above sea level, nestled between the Collegiate Peaks to the west and the Sangre de Cristo Range to the east. The town has a population of maybe 3,000 people on a normal day, but during the rafting season, which runs from late May through August, depending on snowmelt, it can feel like the whole country has shown up with a dry bag and a bucket list. Browns Canyon is a national monument now, and it's one of the most popular whitewater destinations in the entire country. Thousands of people float that stretch every year, from nervous first-timers on guided group trips to experienced kayakers running technical lines solo. The commercial outfitter industry there is well-established, heavily regulated, and safety-focused in ways that go well beyond what most tourists ever think about.
I've spent time looking into how these trips are run, and the level of operational detail is genuinely impressive.
Every guide is certified. Every life jacket or personal flotation device, PFD, in the industry's language is fitted individually to each guest before the trip. Weight limits, water temperature protocols, swimmer rescue procedures, it's all documented, trained, and audited. The outfitters operating in Browns Canyon don't survive on luck. They survive on reputation and compliance. That context matters a lot for what happened that day.
I want you to hold it in your head, not just as background flavor, but as a structural fact.
The system in place was a good one. What went wrong was not the absence of safety infrastructure. It was a series of decisions made inside that infrastructure that dismantled it piece by piece. On the morning of June 14th, the outfitter running this particular trip, I'll call them the company throughout, had a full day of multi-raft groups heading out on a half-day section that included a stretch of Class 3 and Class 4. Rapids. For context, Class 3 water means moderate waves and clear channels that require maneuvering. Class 4 steps that up significantly. Powerful, churning water, more complex routes, less room for error. You can absolutely run Class 4 in a guided group raft. People do it every summer. But it demands that everyone on that raft follow the guide's instructions, stay seated, keep their PFD on, and listen. The guide assigned to one of the rafts that morning was a man named Tom Sobolov. Tom was in his late 20s at this point, and he had been guiding in Colorado for several seasons. He wasn't a rookie. He knew the river, knew the equipment, and by all accounts from the company's internal records and later investigative documentation, he had a solid track record. No prior incidents, no complaints on file, no disciplinary history. He was the kind of guide you'd actually want on your raft. Miriam McDade was on his raft, along with her date, a man I'll call Devin, and several other guests. Miriam was 53 years old, originally from the Phoenix area, and she was visiting Colorado on what appeared to be a leisure trip. She had booked the rafting experience a few days in advance through the company's standard reservation system. Nothing in the booking records flagged any medical conditions or swimming ability concerns, which customers are asked to disclose at the time of booking and again during pre-trip check-in. Whether or not she had read through those pre-trip materials carefully is something we simply don't know. A lot of people don't. They skim past the liability waiver, nod along during the safety briefing, and assume the life jacket is mostly there for show. On most trips, on most days, nothing bad happens, and that assumption never gets tested. That day on the Arkansas, it got tested hard. Before any raft leaves the staging area, every guest gets fitted for a personal flotation device, or PFD. You have to understand that this isn't a handshake deal where they toss you a vest and wish you luck. The guide, or a staging assistant, physically fits the device to the guest's body, checks the buckles, tests the snugness, and makes sure the PFD will stay in place in the water. There's a reason for all of that. A loose PFD can ride up over a swimmer's face in moving water. A PFD that isn't buckled properly can come off entirely. The fitting process exists because the physics of whitewater don't care about comfort levels. According to the incident report that was later reviewed during the investigation, Miriam had difficulties during the fitting process. The standard PFD issued to her was correctly sized for her body weight, but she expressed discomfort with how it felt specifically, that it was too tight across the chest. Tom adjusted it. She said it was still too tight. He adjusted it again. This back and forth lasted long enough that it drew attention at the staging area, with other guests and staff aware that something was taking longer than usual. At this point, before Tom had even finished the second adjustment, Miriam began complaining about the appearance of the PFD itself. She made repeated comments that the vest looked old and worn, pointing at faded stitching and minor cosmetic scuffs that had no bearing on the device's functionality. Several staging employees later recalled her demanding to see a newer life jacket, as if she were returning a defective product at a department store. When staff explained that all PFDs met the same safety certifications regardless of cosmetic condition, she rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about how this place was clearly cutting corners. During this process, Miriam began to escalate, not physically, but vocally. She was loud about her discomfort, dismissive about what she characterized as Tom's inability to solve the problem, and according to at least one account documented in the investigation, she made comments to a staging supervisor that implied Tom didn't know what he was doing. What we can't know for certain is whether she genuinely believed the PFD was improperly fitted, or whether she simply found it uncomfortable in the way that any properly fitted PFD will feel uncomfortable snug, slightly restrictive, not designed for casual lounging. The two are very different problems with very different solutions.
But I get that they can feel identical to someone who has never worn one before and has no framework for what correct is supposed to feel like.
Unfortunately, they got a Karen in their hands. Before the staging supervisor even arrived, Miriam had already started making comments to other guests in the raft area, attempting to rally them to her side. She asked a young couple nearby whether their PFDs felt dangerously tight, and when they said theirs seemed fine, she told them they must not know what to look for. She also made a point of announcing loudly that she had left a bad review for a different outfitter last year and would have no problem doing the same here. The other guests later described feeling embarrassed for her, not threatened by her, but the performance continued regardless. There's also a third possibility worth acknowledging, that Miriam understood on some level that the PFD was fine, but that pushing back on it was a way of asserting control in a situation where she felt she had none.
This is not a psychology podcast, and I'm not going to armchair diagnose anyone here.
But the pattern of behavior resistance, escalation, demanding a personnel change follows a recognizable script. It's the script of someone who is accustomed to getting what they want through social pressure and is deploying that skill in a context where it has no place. I want you to watch carefully, because what happens next is the part that set everything else in motion. The staging supervisor, a man I'll call Garrett, came over to assess the situation. Miriam immediately shifted her complaints from the equipment to Tom's demeanor. She claimed, without any corroboration, that Tom had been rude to her and had rolled his eyes when she first asked for an adjustment. Garrett later testified that he saw no evidence of this and that Tom had remained professional throughout. But Miriam pressed harder, insisting that she did not feel safe with Tom and that if the company forced her to raft with him, she would demand a full refund and contact her credit card company to dispute the charge. The word refund came up multiple times in the staging area that morning. Again, the investigation documents this, though the full picture had to be reconstructed from multiple sources since Miriam herself was not available to give a statement afterward. Garrett's own account, given to both company management and later to investigators, was that Miriam's complaints were persistent and that she requested Tom be removed from her raft. Whether that request was phrased politely or not is not really something I can verify, but the outcome is documented. Garrett made the call to reassign the guests on Tom's raft to another guide, and Tom was pulled from his shift. That decision to remove a certified, experienced guide based on a guest complaint during the pre-launch safety process is one that I think deserves real scrutiny, and we'll come back to it. But first, let's talk about what it means for a guide to be pulled mid-staging. In the operational structure of a commercial outfitter, the staging supervisor has a significant amount of discretionary authority. They're responsible for the overall safety and smooth function of the launch process, and they have to make judgment calls quickly. On one hand, if a guest and a guide have a genuine interpersonal conflict that can't be resolved, splitting them up can be a reasonable move. On the other hand, the safety fitting process is not a customer service interaction. It is a literal safety procedure. Tom, by the account in the investigation, did not argue. He handed off his raft to another guide, a less experienced staff member I'll call Ruben, and stepped back. The trip launched, and Tom stood at the staging area and watched it go. Apparently, Miriam made a point of watching him walk away with what witnesses described as a satisfied expression. She then turned to Devin, her date, and said something in a low voice that made him shift uncomfortably. One guest in an adjacent raft later recalled hearing Miriam say, "That's how you get things done," as if she had just successfully negotiated a hotel room upgrade rather than having a trained professional removed from a safety-critical position. Devin, by all accounts, did not respond. If I were him, I'd want to disappear into the raft floor, but I want to sit with that image for a second here too. Tom was a professional. He knew that raft, that group, that river. He had been in the middle of a safety-critical task when he was pulled from it. He complied, because that's what a professional does when a supervisor makes a call, even a bad one. But he also knew, at least in general terms, that the PFD situation on that raft had not been fully resolved. What he did or didn't say in those final moments at the staging area isn't documented in a way I can report as fact. But the investigation found that no adequate communication bridge was built between him and Ruben before the raft went into the water. What the investigation later zeroed in on was the question of what happened to the PFD situation when the handoff occurred. Tom had been in the middle of a fitting dispute. He knew the status of that PFD better than anyone else on the property at that moment. Ruben, stepping in cold, was receiving a group of guests mid-process, with no briefing on what was unresolved and why it mattered. The documentation from the incident report suggests that no clear communication occurred between Tom and Ruben about the unresolved PFD status. Whether that was a procedural failure on the company's part, a communication breakdown between the two guides, or simply the chaos of a rushed handoff that nobody had prepared a protocol for, the result was the same. Ruben launched with a guest whose PFD compliance was, at best, an open question. I want to be careful here because I'm not in the business of assigning blame to Ruben. He was put in an unfair position. He stepped up when asked, took a group he didn't know, and did his job, but the outcome is what it is. The trip proceeded normally for the first part of the run. Browns Canyon's lower sections ease you in before the water gets serious, and a well-guided group can build confidence and settle into the rhythm of paddling before the bigger features arrive. There's something almost counterintuitive about the early miles of that run. The river looks deceptively manageable. The canyon walls are gorgeous, the water is clear, and if you've never been in real whitewater before, you might look at the first few ripples and think the whole thing was overblown. That relaxation can be dangerous, because the river doesn't stay mellow. Ruben was a certified guide. He knew the river. river. The other guests on the raft were, by all indications, following instructions and paddling cooperatively. Miriam, though, appears to have been a problem on the water as well, based on the plausibility assessments made during the investigation. Given the pattern established at staging the complaints, the resistance, the escalation, investigators considered it plausible, and I think reasonably so, that she may have continued to be non-compliant on the raft. This is inferred from physical evidence and witness statements from the other guests, not from direct observation. No one was watching her every move throughout the entire trip, but the picture that emerges suggests someone who had not fully bought into the safety framework she was operating inside. The other guests on the raft later described the trip as tense in a way they couldn't fully articulate, which isn't surprising. It's hard to explain why a dynamic feels off when you can't point to one specific thing. Tense is the word that came up more than once. One specific point that came up repeatedly in the investigation was the state of her PFD during the on-water portion of the trip. Without a confirmed resolution to the fitting issue at staging, and given the handoff that occurred, investigators assessed it as plausible that Miriam's PFD was not properly secured for at least some portion of the trip. Again, this is reconstruction based on physical evidence and the circumstances of what was found later, confirmed by a direct witness who saw her on the water at that specific moment. The Class 4 section of this particular run is a stretch that the guides know intimately. The features there are consistent. They're shaped by canyon walls and bedrock, not shifting sandbars, so experienced guides can read the water and position the raft to avoid the worst hydraulics. A hydraulic, sometimes called a hole, is a recirculating feature at the base of a drop where water curls back upstream and can trap and hold a swimmer. Getting caught in a hydraulic is the kind of thing that kills people even when they're wearing their PFD properly. Without one, the math changes dramatically. The investigation was unable to reconstruct exactly what happened at the rapid. What it could establish was a sequence of facts. The raft entered the rapid section with all guests and the guide aboard, and it exited without Miriam. The raft did not capsize. No other guests went overboard. Ruben was present and functional on the raft when shore staff observed the raft coming through downstream. The most plausible scenario, and the one the investigation treated as the most likely based on physical evidence, was that Miriam went over the side of the raft during the rapid section and was immediately separated from the group. How that happened, whether she was thrown by a wave, stood up at the wrong moment, shifted her weight unexpectedly, failed to brace properly, or some combination of factors, cannot be stated with certainty. What can be said is that she entered the water in a Class 4 environment, and her PFD situation made survival in that environment significantly less likely than it would have been for a guest in proper compliance. A human body in cold, fast, technical water has very few resources available to it. Proper buoyancy is at the top of that list. Without it, the river doesn't give you much to work with. Ruben, for his part, faced an impossible split-second situation, the kind of high-stakes, life-or-death moment that river guides train for but hope never actually comes. Imagine this. You have a raft full of guests, each one trusting you with their safety. You have moving water, churning and unpredictable, with hidden rocks and currents. And you have a person in the river suddenly separated from the craft and at the mercy of the flow. In that instant, Ruben's mind had to process dozens of variables: the speed of the water, the weight of the raft, the location of hazards, and the desperate cries of the swimmer. His immediate responsibility, as any certification course would teach, was to the guests still on the raft, the ones he could still protect, the ones who had not yet been lost to the current. Recovering a swimmer overboard while simultaneously managing a fully loaded raft through technical water is simply not a one-person job. It requires a coordinated team and a calm environment. The standard protocols for that exact situation, protocols developed from decades of accident analysis and expert consensus, involve first getting the raft to calm water, then securing the raft against further drift or flip, and only then initiating swimmer recovery procedures. They do not involve abandoning the raft and jumping in after someone in the middle of a rapid, because doing so would almost certainly leave the remaining guests unguided and at even greater risk. Ruben followed those protocols to the letter. He did what the protocols required, even as every human instinct might have screamed to dive in after the lost person. Whether that was the right call in a human sense, a moral, emotional, gut-level sense, and whether it was the right call in a technical, procedural, risk management sense are two separate conversations, each with its own weight. I won't pretend to have a simple answer here. I'll let you decide on that for yourself. When a raft reaches the takeout point, what outfitters call the termination staging area shore staff are waiting. They're doing a head count, logging arrivals, helping guests out of the water, and managing the end-of-trip process. The company's protocols required that every raft arrive with the same number of guests that launched. This sounds obvious. but it's a hard count every time, because the alternative is the scenario where someone is missing and no one notices until hours later. When Rubin's raft arrived, shore staff flagged the discrepancy immediately. A guest was unaccounted for. Rubin, from everything in the documentation, reported what had happened to the best of his knowledge. The company's emergency protocols activated right away, and I do want to give them credit for that. Shore staff coordinated with river authorities, initiated contact with search and rescue, and began locking down the incident for documentation. The clock that matters in a missing swimmer situation is very short. Cold water, strong current, and the mechanics of drowning don't wait for bureaucratic processes. Devin Miriam's date, the man who had accompanied her to the river that day, was present at the termination staging area, along with the other guests who had been evacuated from the raft trip. He did not vanish, he did not make a scene, and he did not seek attention. Instead, he gave a brief, straightforward statement to the company guides and to the responding authorities who arrived on the scene. That statement was short, factual, and cooperative. Nothing more, nothing less. He did not speak to the media. Not a single reporter, not a single camera, not a single quote attributed to him in any news outlet. That's consistent across everything I found in my own review of the incident. No interviews, no social media posts, no public commentary whatsoever. He was transported separately from the other guests, which may have been by design or by circumstance, I don't know, and I'm not speculating. Once at the staging area, he answered the questions he was asked, gave whatever information he had, and then stepped back. And that was the extent of his visible involvement in what came after, the aftermath, the investigation, the media coverage, the quiet return to normal life. I'm not reading anything into that. I'm not implying he was cold or distant or unusually composed. I'm simply reporting what the record shows. He had just experienced something genuinely traumatic, a sudden, violent, life-altering event on the water, and he had no obligation to do anything else. No obligation to speak to reporters, no obligation to comfort strangers, no obligation to offer a public statement, no obligation to explain himself or his reaction to anyone. He showed up, he answered, and he withdrew. That is his right. That is more than enough. Search and rescue operations on a river like the Arkansas use a combination of physical searching and predictive modeling. The way moving water works, a submerged or floating object. How clinical that sounds when we're talking about a person. Predictable paths based on current speed, channel shape, and the locations of eddies. An eddy is a section of calmer, slower water on the downstream side of an obstruction like a boulder or a bend in the bank. Floating objects and, unfortunately, swimmers tend to collect in eddies. That's where search teams look first, and that's where they deploy the most resources. Teams deploy downstream from the last known position, working the eddy lines in slow water while other personnel walked the shoreline. The Arkansas in this stretch isn't a smooth, flat river even outside the rapid sections. It's technical, boulder-strewn, and the banks are rough enough that a shoreline search requires real effort and real footing. The canyon walls close in at certain points and make aerial observation complicated. It's not an easy environment to search, even when you know roughly what drift path to follow. Miriam was located several hours after the initial alert was broadcast to search and rescue teams. She was found in a slower eddy zone, a calm pocket of water downstream of the main rapid section, which was entirely consistent with the drift modeling that the search teams had used to predict where a swimmer would most likely be carried by the current. The fact that she ended up exactly where the models predicted is, in its own grim and sobering way, a testament to how well the teams knew their environment. Every bend, every boulder, every hydraulic feature that shapes the river's violent choreography. She was recovered by water-based search personnel who had been navigating the same technical channels, and she was transported to a staging area where medical professionals were waiting. Despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death, as confirmed by the subsequent autopsy and incident review, was drowning specifically. Freshwater drowning in the cold, fast-moving flow of the Arkansas River, complicated by the fact that her personal flotation device was not properly secured at the time she entered the water. Her PFD, when examined, was found to be improperly secured. The specifics of that finding, which buckles, in what state are part of the incident documentation, but the headline is clear. It was not on her the way it should have been. Whether that was the state it was in when she entered the water, or whether it shifted or came loose during her time in the river, investigators considered both possibilities. But the weight of the physical evidence pointed toward a PFD that had not been properly fastened before the trip launched. That finding circled back directly to the staging dispute, the handoff, and the unresolved status that Rubin had never been told about. The raft was recovered separately downstream and logged as part of the incident record. The official incident classification noted both a procedural failure in the termination staging process, meaning the handoff from Tom to Ruben, without proper status communication, and PFD noncompliance escalation, meaning the chain of events starting from the staging dispute. After the final report was filed and the outfitter's reputation took a lasting hit, it became painfully clear that Miriam's relentless need to assert control and demand special treatment didn't just cost a guide his job, it cost her the very people who could have helped her when the water turned deadly. Being a Karen doesn't just alienate strangers, it quietly dismantles the safety net of goodwill and patience around you, leaving you isolated at the exact moment you need others most.